Hello and welcome to Nations of Charlemagne, Episode 9, the Early Italian Renaissance. Today we are going to be discussing the fallout of the demise of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, the toppling of the regime in Italy, Manfred of Sicily, and the execution of Conradin, and what the implications were for the next 200 years, economic, political, and of course cultural, which is obviously the main thrust of the idea of the Renaissance. Very lucky, as always, to be joined by Columba and Marcus Furious Pertinax. Hello.
It's a pleasure to be here, gentlemen.
Good evening, everybody. Hello.
And just a proviso regarding this episode sort of moving forward, the Renaissance in totality, if we're going to assume the broadest possible time frame, so in this case I've decided on 1250 until 1600, is obviously far too much to include in a single episode. So this is going to cover the first half of the Renaissance up until the middle of the 15th century. And later on this topic, episode 12, we are going to be talking about the Italian Wars, and that's where we really focus on the latter aspect. So if you're tuning in for Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, etc., all those aspects will be covered in episode 12. So just to start off, I think it's a good idea to get into the etymology and the origin of the term Renaissance, or in Italian Rinascimento. Marcus, is there anything you want to comment on that?
So something that's interesting is for those of us, of our ilk, you might say, if you look at the word, if you break it down, there's a sort of a joint linkage to the word that we use in today's vernacular, where we make reference to nation, and nation being, if you search back far enough in the etymology, it's a derivative of the Latin natio, which is actually still the Italian word for birth. If you look on a birth certificate, natio is the word that the Italians use, and natio does go back into Latin. It's actually a word that from Italian to Latin doesn't actually change in its original meaning. But in terms of referencing the Renaissance specifically, it's more a French adoption of the vulgar Latin term renascere, or from the strict Latin renasci, to be well, that's ecclesiastical, not classical Latin, because they don't use the the same Italian pronunciation of SCI, but it essentially means to be born again, to rise again, to reappear. So you have the prefix re, which is the same in English, we use it in the same way, and then nasci, or nasci derivative from natio, again reborn, to rebirth. And I believe this was sort of first used in this context from around mid 1800s, like sort of in the post-Napoleonic era, and it's sort of become really central to this period in time. And like you've said, the Renaissance is a movement born in Italy, and it's used almost in a geographical context to reference Italy this time.
But would you say
the movement thereafter?
Would you say the term, of course, becomes more popular and more widely used once we get into the age of Italian nationalism and what have you?
I think undoubtedly there's a linkage between there's a shared kind of context between the Renaissance, as we refer to it. I forgot the Italian word that Apostolic used, and the
it's
Italian
just here on the slide, Rinascimento. So
as you mentioned, I'm totally blind.
So as you mentioned, Rinasci again is the derivative, as you said,
of course.
In Latin.
Of course. So exactly right. So Rinascimento and Risorgimento are quite similar words. So for them to be used conjointly, I mean, it was you might say it was something of a coup for the propagandists in Italy at the time. I mean, whether those people had true motives or ulterior motives is another question, I suppose, for another stream.
I'd like to emphasize actually regarding this, because I think it's important to note that this term has a lot of intellectual, ideological, and historical baggage.
Correct.
Obviously,
yes.
You mentioned the figure, the middle of the 19th century. It's this figure in the middle here, the painting of Jules Michelet. It's a term that derives from the 1867 book Histoire de France. And in terms of trying to find a precedent for it, Jules Michelet takes it from Giorgio Vasari, who you could say in many senses founded contemporary art history. And I think he's famous for his the lives of the most excellent painters, sculptors, and architects, etc. And it's in this book that we have the term Rinascimento, which is again utilized by obviously the French Jules Michelet to create the term Renaissance. But in terms of, again, you mentioned the fact natio, I think it again is not coincidental that this period 1867 is also a couple of years after the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy, and again the national aspect of this and how this is played into the you could say the national mythology of Italy is absolutely essential. But in terms of also the political implications of this, both figures here who are, in terms of 19th century historiography, because again, like Byzantium, Renaissance is a historiographical invention. It didn't exist within the contemporary mindsets of the time, the term, but definitely the feeling around it did. When we get to Jules Michelet in particular, it's very important to note that he was a anti-clerical historian of the French Revolution. And
yes, this is what
his,
I wanted to bring up. Right, it's this idea of
there's another one.
The rebirth of our civilization after the oppression of the church and what have you.
Absolutely, it's the Histoire de France is very much written with a perspective of talking about progressivism and the Enlightenment in France vis-a-vis the denigration, stagnation, and colorlessness of the medieval period, etc. So it's very much emphasized in historiography to I argue for a breach in history as opposed to a gentle evolution or continuity. And I think, for any viewer of this series, indeed orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality, I think you can see the slow developing trends, in regards to all of these aspects are germinating all the time in the background throughout this, which manifest in this so-called Renaissance or Rinascimento. So the term is again very politically charged, and of course Jacob Burckhardt makes great use of this idea in his Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy. And again, it's despising this idea of the medieval era as fundamentally stagnant, and against the idea of progress and enlightenment, as with the French revolutionary tradition, so to speak.
However, which is an absurd claim to make, in my opinion. I mean, if you look at the developments all throughout the centuries, I mean, none of it would have happened without the church being there. I mean, people like Dante, who we will get into. I hope we can demonstrate that you would not have had Dante without people like Aquinas, and it's just obvious.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and Burckhardt's. Sorry, Marcus.
Oh no, you finish your sentence, Paul, so I'll come in after.
In Burckhardt's view, again, it's important to note that Burckhardt is very much a classical historian. Much of his vein of art history dates back to this idea that everything has to start with Greece. So again, placing Greece in ancient history and the revivalism of ancient Greece and Neoplatonic thinking and humanism, etc., at the heart of the thought process of Western Europe, removed almost from its Christian trappings, is therefore an essential component for Jacob Burckhardt as to delineate a period of the original civilization, the declines, the so-called Middle Ages, or would arise in this age also, the Dark Ages, to refer to pejoratively at this period, and then the flowering, the intellectual blossoming in the recovery of these ideas from the ancient Greeks, the Renaissance. So yes, Marcus, go ahead.
What's interesting is this paradox that stems from thinkers like Jules Michelet and Voltaire and others, and particularly in the Byzantium streams, I've more than once referenced that speech by Edward Luttwak, where he references this immense antagonism that these post-revolution, you might say, early liberal writers have against the Byzantine influence, and how they sort of deride them as being theocratic and Greek and sort of backstabbing, untrustworthy, orthodox Eastlings that aren't responsible for any kind of civilization rejuvenation. Yet, what do we see with the fall of Constantinople in 1453 at the hands of Mehmed II? There is, and one can say, does it happen as a consequence of? Does it happen simultaneously? Is it happenstance? I mean, these are complicated questions, but there is no doubt there is a specific degree of influence. There is a profound effect that occurs with the transition, with this sort of fleeing of the Greeks from the east into Italy, and you have people coming in, such as Plethon. I'm sure we'll touch on him later, among others, along with a number of noble families who also flee to Italy, that partake and are partially responsible for this flourishing, this efflorescence of what we term now the Renaissance, and that this seed, this trigger, was caused by people who came from this theocratic Greekling empire in the East that writers like Jules Michelet deride. There's a really interesting hypocrisy at the very seed of that thought.
Well, it goes beyond that even. I mean, as no doubt all of us will agree, the beginning of this happens in the late 11th and 12th centuries during the Crusades. The Crusades, which are the most iconic aspect of medieval history, are also the most important facilitator of all of these economic and cultural and intellectual trends throughout this entire period again. So the idea that this fundamental aspect of Christian history, the recovery and the integration of the Levant and parts of Anatolia with the rest of Western Christendom, could at the same time be responsible for this massive increase in the economic and artistic potential of Europe. Again, there seems to be a fundamental contradiction baked into this idea.
Yeah, and it's not just a total accident as well, right? Because people will turn around to what you've just said, Marcus, and they will say, well, yeah, I mean, but Constantinople had to fall, right, for these things to happen, and it was just a sort of a big accident, and then the West picked up what was left. But I mean, it is interesting. I mean, I believe it was Manuel II, Paleologos, which is of course after the fall. You're getting into the late 1300s. He actually sends this guy called Manuel Chrysoloras to the West, to Italy, and to France to sort of on a sort of diplomatic mission, if you will, as part of his drumming up of support. He teaches Greek. He goes around teaching Greek and befriending scholars and members of the clergy and what have you. And so it's not just this total accident. There is a concerted sort of cultural effort being made on behalf of the East here. Although I will, I mean, there was a lot of backstabbing in Byzantium. I mean, I will give them that point. But
well, they did maintain that Roman tradition, didn't they?
Yes, and of course, and of course, the culmination of this idea is something which we'll get to right at the end of the stream, which is talking about the Council of Florence, which you can see is the greatest example of a Greek ambassador involving an emperor himself visiting Italy to make the case for the Eastern Roman Empire. But just, I think, again,
is that John Cantacuzénos, John VIII?
Yes, indeed.
Yes, okay. I was actually going to touch on him, but if we get to him later, then I'll save it.
Absolutely. So it'll be towards the end of the discussion where we talk about the Medicis. But talking about the consciousness and trying to give these writers some slack, it's important to emphasize that around the turn of the middle of the 14th century, just after the Black Death, which of course hit Europe in the 1340s, there is this burgeoning conception among certain thinkers such as Biondo and Petrarch that there is a new age dawning, that there is a present moment which is again divided by a concept which is derived from this time, a Middle Ages, which connects back to antiquity. And in terms of, again, this being further substantiated, of course, it should be noted that Vasari, who you could say coined the original term that would be popularized by Jules Michelet, of course, uses this term, and he's talking at the tail end of the Renaissance in the 16th century. And also even the terminology of the Dark Ages, again, it's used periodically by Petrarch, but in terms of like a formal historiographical designation, it's used in the 6th century by the Papal States itself to refer to the era of the Theophylacty during the 9th and the 10th century. But of course, in the 19th century, that term extends, and I think it's in terms of that specific historiographical application, I think we're all in agreement that, especially for central Italy, the 9th and the 10th century does represent some form of Secellum Obscurum. But in terms of using that as a basis to denigrate, from the 19th century onwards, this entire period as the Dark Ages, again, invites all of these criticisms, again, stemming from this anti-clerical idea, which is, of course, whipped up by the Enlightenment tradition and the French Revolutionary tradition.
Although, of course, there is extent to which I mean one will disagree, but one can understand the frustrations of people like Petrarch and Petrarch's, I think, slightly younger contemporary Boccaccio, who everyone will know from writing the Decameron. You know, it's a sort of collection of stories of a bunch of people hiding out from the plague, and of course it's written in the vernacular. But the really interesting thing about Boccaccio as well is that he was alive around the time of the Avignon papacy, right? The so-called Babylonian captivity, and he actually lived in Avignon for some time, and seems to have been very displeased with what he saw there. And so you have a combination of these things. You have the undeniable political corruption and chaos, and also the Black Death, and it does lead to a disillusionment. But I mean, if you actually read the writings and not what other people write about them, you can see that these are still, you know, men of deep faith, right, and men who don't want to destroy everything around them.
And this, of course, goes throughout the entire humanist movement at the same time, as
Indeed.
opposed to later developments and later revisions regarding that period. And again, just to emphasize before we move on, and just to recap on some of the stuff we've already covered during this period. Renaissance Italy, just again, even the idea of a specific breach. When we're talking about a culturally enriched and integrated and prosperous Italy, we, of course, Marcus, back on our episode, The Guelphs and Ghibellines, discussed how the Norman, Arabic, and Greek fusion of cultures in Sicily represent, and especially the court in Palermo, represented, again, one of the most vibrant, exotic, and powerful courts in Europe at that time. And of course, that was later used as the political basis for establishing the Dominium Mundi of the Emperor of Stupa Mundi, Frederick II, although of course that attempt failed. So this idea of some sort of breach, some sort of period, and then the arrival of the Renaissance does seem flatly ridiculous if you look at it within this broad evolutionary strain, especially when you look about the interaction between the Italian principalities in the East. Even looking at our stream that we did on Venice, this again, this constant interaction with the East and the West, and this you can say at first this mutually beneficial relationship, which of course in the case of Venice gets corrupted, is always present. And I think this is a good time to talk about in terms of, again, this stream going forward. I'm going to try and divide these topics, because I think a lot has been made about the cultural developments, but seldom has anyone actually talked about a lot of the political developments which are going on through the next 400 years. We're going
which
to discuss.
are also pretty seismic, if we're being
which
honest.
also pretty seismic. Yeah. So
indeed, just on that point, AM, just because you referenced our Guelph and Ghibelline stream and our stream on like the Normans in Sicily, I just want to say that what's important here as a reference point for people is that sort of there's a gradual. Obviously, Italy doesn't achieve nationhood until 1860, sort of 10 years before the Prussians do with Germany. But with Italian culture and Italian language, the solidification of an Italian identity, I would say, begins at this time. You have traces of it in the south, with Roger II's kingdom, but Italy up until this sort of high medieval period has been a battleground between the Holy Roman Emperor and its descendant kings of Italy, to, in inverted commas, the descendants of Charlemagne and so on, and the Holy Roman Emperors, between firstly Byzantium, and then Byzantium fades away, and then we have the Arabs in Sicily, and then we have the Normans arrive, etc., etc. It is at this point in time, sort of the sort of early Crusader period onwards, and by that, well, the third, fourth Crusade onwards, say like Venice having become to prominence after the Fourth Crusade, we really start to see this transition, this prevalence of an Italian sense of identity and Italian city-states coming to the fore of their own sort of identity and their own will, and sort of engaging in the amongst their competitors and amongst their fellow city-states and neighbours outside of Italy of their own accord, without themselves necessarily subject. This occurs in this period, and it's the first time it's occurred in Italy really since the fall of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, I mean,
this
it's not.
Point is here.
Yeah, I mean, there's not, of course, political unification, but it does, in some senses, remind one, I suppose, of the situation in ancient Greece. I mean, with the Persians bearing down on them and what have you. There's this growing realization of the cultural commonalities, I would say, but there are still
definitely
incredibly
a cultural
divisions.
a cultural and a linguistic sort of awareness of the fact that they are Italians rather than just being sort of the frontier people of someone else.
Yes, but I would say that they all remain, they're Italians second and still Florentines first or Pisans first and what have you. Which again is
Well,
also the situation in Greece, if we're being honest. The
well, for
Athenians
those
can
who
make
have,
all this highfalutin rhetoric about their new league and what have you, but we really know what's going on. I mean, it's the
I
same
mean,
kind of political
for any,
power plays.
for anyone who knows any Italians firsthand or has themselves travelled to Italy, you'll know that regionalism is still very well alive in Italy today. I'll just leave it at there.
Indeed.
I think a good way to summarize this is during the Guelph and Ghibelline period, I'm very keen to emphasize the fact that this is a fundamental fight over the universal authority in Christianity, whether that be the emperor or whether that be the pope. After the death of Conradin and basically the extermination of the House of Hohenstaufen, you see a temporary victory for the papacy. But as we're going to demonstrate throughout the 14th century and the 15th century, you see brief revivals at establishing a papal supremacy and an imperial supremacy, all of which come to nothing during this period. And by the end of this period, so we're talking the Peace of Lodi in 1454, we're talking about a conscious collaboration, an agreement among all the major Italian parties who, again, you have this disintegration of authority, you have the creation of the communes, the smaller Italian states, and then during this period you have a political consolidation, whereby by 1454 you have several prominent powers that can collectively maintain the peace in Italy. And I think in terms of establishing an Italian consciousness, this commitment, and in this case it's the Papal States, it's the Neapolitan Crown, it's Florence, it's the Milanese Duchy, and it's the Republic of Venice, all of these powers collectively coming together to ensure this unprecedented period of peace and stability from 1454 until 1494. I think really you can say throughout this entire period, even beyond that, getting to the unification of Italy is one of the greatest moments of this self-consciously Italian league, so to speak. This idea of a united Italy, not
and it wouldn't have happened
I'd agree
without
with
this.
that.
Yeah, and it wouldn't have happened without this constant pressure, right? Whether it be from France or be from the Empire.
Yes, and I think that's a good opportunity to get into the chronology, if that's all right. So just to iterate, we've had the death of Conradin, we've had the Sicilian Vespers, which unmake the unification of the Kingdom of Sicily. Innocent IV, triumphs temporarily against Frederick II, but he dies and the papacy begins to decline very rapidly after this period. In Germany, a Stauffer Count, Rudolf, is elected as King of the Romans. I think this is important to emphasize that the Guelph and the Ghibelline conflict doesn't stop after our stream period, essentially. What we demonstrated in that stream is that what began as a dynastic conflict, the Guelphs, obviously the Welf family, and the Ghibellines from the battle cry of the House of Hohenstaufens, that emerges from a dynastic conflict into a conflict between the universal authority in Christendom, the Guelph faction, of course, being pro-pope, and the Ghibelline faction being pro-emperor. After you have the collapse of the imperial cause proper, where the emperor had any sort of opportunity to unite all of Christendom under his nominal authority, or Italy at least, once that collapses, you have this association, whether it be Ghibelline or Guelph, exists within the families that have fought during this period and within the certain city of affiliations. And the cause, again, morphs, although it has become provincial. And again, this is this idea of Italian interest prioritizing over these grander interests or more universal interests of Christendom, so to speak. So one of the first Ghibelline strongholds, which emerges after the demise of the Hohenstaufens, is one of the first Italian communes, which is the city of Forlì, which is nominally within the donations of Pepin, i.e. the Papal States, which you see on the map on the left here. And of course, what does the Ghibelline conflict become now? It's not about asserting the supremacy of the emperor. It's simply avoiding being dominated by the temporal power of the papacy. And so this moves on, and it encounters sort of other applications. So Guelphs become anti-German, as you mentioned, Colombo, with this idea of constant external pressure, and they also become pro-French due to their association with the Angevin dynasty in Naples. And of course, this will seriously come back to bite them later on. And of course, this it results in both intercity conflict, such as the famous Battle of the Bucket between Bologna and Modena, but this also involves intracity conflicts, such as the Guelphs and Ghibellines in Florence. So, and of course, this extends beyond Florence. So, in the city of Genoa, you have the Spinola family, which are Ghibelline, and you have the Grimaldi family, which are Guelph. And at points, these two families hold power jointly. And going back to the case of Florence, the Guelph faction virtually wipes out the Ghibelline faction in 1289 at the Battle of Campaldino. And what this does is it doesn't create this, newfound allegiance to the Pope. What happens is that the Guelph faction instead splits into the white and the black Guelph factions.
So Italian. It's so Italian.
And the white Guelph faction, of course, of which Dante was famously a member. And again, it should be emphasized.
Dante actually fought in the battle.
Yes, he actually fought against the Ghibellines in Campaldino, but here he is 10 years later, allying essentially with the Imperial cause, though as a Guelph, to make it even more complicated, just to advocate how much, again, these causes have mutated. And again, emphasizing the fact that the papacy, despite you would have thought on paper having won this conflict against the emperor, of course, what did it do? It allied itself with the Capetian dynasty in France. And of course, Boniface VIII is now contesting with Philip IV in France, as you and I
just transfers the problem.
So it just transfers the problem. And rather than successfully resisting it, as they had with the Hohenstaufens, Boniface VIII is assaulted and indirectly killed by the agents of Philip IV. And rather than fight this, the papacy decides to fully be co-opted by the French. And from 1305 to 1378, the papacy moves to Avignon. So what's the effect on the political situation in Italy? Well, from 1305 until 1378, all of the attempts of the Pope to actually control this, as you can see, quite substantial domain in the center of Italy begin to collapse. And in terms of the relative wealth, the area begins to decline relative to the areas in the north, as this has already happened with Sicily and Naples at the same time. And this is where I really want to get your input, Columba, because on the one hand, you have the rise of the Orsini and Colonna families in the city. And outside, for example, you have the d'Este family in Ferrara advocating an independent authority. But this anarchy gives rise to one of the most unique figures in medieval history, from my point of view at least, which is the rise of Coro de Rienzo. Is there anything you want to sort of elucidate? Because I know you find this historical figure particularly interesting.
Coro de Rienzo is interesting. I mean, he leads a sort of, I suppose, a sort of popular rebellion in the city, and he's deeply dissatisfied with the sort of the corruption that he sees all around him. In many ways, I see him as a sort of precedent to someone like Savonarola, where he's rallying the people in indignation at the constant bitter infighting of these families. But it's interesting as well because he also he harks back to the ancient world. It's one of the first cases of this. I mean, I believe he gets the people to elect him as like a tribune of the plebs or something like this, and he even claims descent from the ancient families. And this is actually something, to be fair, which is quite common. I mean, Dante also claims descent from the ancient Romans. I mean, he can't name any names, of course, but there's just this deep resentment building up, and you have these notes of Italian nationalism as well, and the situation isn't helped by the fact that, of course, whilst the papacy is in Avignon, all of the governors and papal legates who are sent to govern these papal possessions on the peninsula are French, and this just enrages the Italians, and the resentment grows and grows.
Yes, these are the papal vicars who are basically, again, you can say like a repeat of the Exarchate of Ravenna and the way that they were appointing Greek appointees.
Yes, all names like Robert,
Yes, history is repeating itself, in that the locus of authority again is foreign rule is a Greek authority. This is reorientating towards France, but of course, this causes a virtual collapse in papal authority until we have the invasion of a Spanish clergyman, Cardinal Albanoz, and you have the meeting of all of these papal vicars after he vacates, and we have the promulgation of the Constitution of Holy Mother Church, and this establishes, you could say, a first uniform civil code for the Papal States. Nevertheless, this doesn't inaugurate the return of the Pope. We have, Pope Urban V's balked attempt to come back to Italy in the 1360s. And of course, this attempt to establish a pope back in Italy is one of the driving forces for the Western Schism, which we'll talk about in a couple of slides' time. I mentioned the fact that there was a imperial restoration during this period. Of course, as we briefly touched on last time, Henry VII is elected as King of the Romans. Very quickly, he comes down to Italy and tries to raise up essentially the Ghibelline cause in Italy, which had essentially been dormant now for over 60 years. And during his very brief time in Italy, he actually makes substantial sort of political inroads, especially when it comes to Milanese politics, which will have a marked influence over the course of Italian history for the next 100 years beyond that. However, he dies very shortly onwards, and apart from the eternal praise of Dante, he has left very little in terms of a lasting legacy, because of course Dante representing that last pro-imperial advocate. And of course, Louis the Bavarian, another figure we discussed on our previous stream, has a equally short-lived imperial presence. And afterwards, when we have the pathetic attempt of characters like Charles IV, who come down and basically agree that he'll leave the city immediately and make no sort of political claim in order for his coronation to go ahead. This again represents that all of these factions are literally absentee, where once the emperor and the pope had been both located in Italy and were fighting over Italy as part of a wider feud for the hegemony of Christendom. Now the emperors and the popes are vacating Italy, and in the absence of these dual authorities, you're seeing the creation of these more localized authorities. So on the one hand, we've already talked about Venice extensively on another stream, but moving on from Genoa in particular, Genoa begins establishing its maritime and economic influence in the Black Sea and in the Aegean Sea, and of course it'll be Genoese sailors who bring the Black Death in the 1340s through from the Crimean Peninsula. During this time, we have the relative decline of the Republic of Pisa, which is shown on this map. Oh, I do apologize if it's Dutch. I tried to find an English version of this map, but this was the only version of this map I could find, sadly. For some reason,
you can work it out. It's not that hard. Just come now.
Just on that note too, it's actually worth mentioning very briefly, AM, that just coming off the back of our previous streams pertaining to the Crusades, Pisa is arguably the strongest of the maritime city-states prior to the rise of Venice in the 4th century and in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, because Pisa actually, throughout the second, third crusade, of all the maritime city-states, actually offers the majority of its naval support into the Levant and into cities such as Acre and Tyre and Latakia. So there's a transfer of power here between these maritime states.
I mean, well, Pisa does also have some influence when we get to the schism, right? I mean, we have Pisan popes.
Yes, that's quite later. Ironically, that's after Pisa has lost most of its political independence. But during this period, we have an architectural renaissance in Pisa, which of course is epitomized by their famous Leaning Tower, which again you can say is almost a contrasting style to that of the Florentine style we see later on. But also Pisa becomes one of the major centers of learning in Italy during this time, but also a factor which aids in its demise, Marcus, is that Pisa remains definitively pro-Ghibelline during this entire period, and it's surrounded by the eventually more powerful Republic of Venice, which is of course definitively Guelph. So this plays a part as well.
And per this map here, you have this burgeoning Florentine state that is growing to the south of it. And for anyone who's ever travelled to this part of Italy, and three cities keep in mind is Pisa itself, and then Lucca and Massa, which are in very close proximity. Do not call them Florentines. If you ever travel there, never call them Florentines. Sorry, I am.
Yes, and someone who has gone there as well. There is an amazing amount of local patriotism. In this case, it was from Lucca in particular. But yes, all of these areas have their own again, not just local sort of city identity, but political independence. So, of course, the Republic of Lucca also extends at the expense of the Republic of Pisa eventually at the same time. Just again, one major note to consider is that Sicily, which was so central in our conversation pertaining to the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, during this time, so we're talking the 13th and 14th centuries, we see a massive reorientation in the wealth of Italy upward north. So this is where we have, again, the association which still exists today with the north being prosperous and the south being relatively poor. The Po Valley and the maritime republics become, the center of European trade during this point. And areas, such as Milan, etc., and of course Tuscany as well, grow exceptionally wealthy. Whereas areas such as Rome, Latium, these areas which have been, wealthy vis-a-vis the north ever since the Roman Empire, begin their long decline. And of course, many people have advocated that this is due to the fact that in the south, especially with Kingdom of Naples, was was excessively overly centralized compared to the more sort of economically decentralized nature of the south. And of course, what happens to Sicily? There's one major exception, Columba, to this idea of independence from national encroachment, which is the rise of the Kingdom of Aragon, which will be very important later for talking about the rise of the Spanish in Italy. Aragon takes over under King Peter the island of Sicily after the Sicilian Vespers. The Sicilian Vespers, incidentally, causes a great amount of economic and political strife in Sicily. And of course, this means that there is no sort of royal court at Palermo anymore. The Aragonese court is still in Spain. It's, if I believe correctly, it's the cities of Zaragoza and the cities of Valencia. So this vibrant court in Palermo, which had been here since, you could argue, even before the emirate of Sicily, is now lost, and the political center of this area has now moved towards Spain, whilst at the same time we see the Aragonese taking over Sardinia, which again is going to be another loss for the comparative economic influence of Pisa, which, in addition to holding Corsica, which transfers its again allegiance to the Genoese, Sardinia too is lost to nominal Italian rule.
I suppose if you're just a province, there isn't this same clamor for wealth and what's the word I'm looking for? Yeah, there's not this centralization, there's not this intensity of administration. Whereas I mean, Palermo under Frederick, it's the sort of center of activities, drawing anyone of talent there, Whereas I suppose it was perhaps a tad neglected in this period.
Well, it's even beyond this period. I mean, this goes on even when we have several moments. Yes, we have several moments of reunification. So the first reunification is something we'll touch on right at the end of the stream, which is the reunification under Alfonso de Aragona. After that, we have a unification in the 18th century rather, and then we have a unification in the 19th century in the former Kingdom of Two Sicilies. The locus of power never goes back to Palermo. It remains in Naples, and Naples becomes the senior capital for the south of Italy to this day. So yes, the significance of Palermo as even rivaling, if not eclipsing, Paris and London during this time is lost forever.
Indeed, yes, and we also have, massive amounts of wealth being built up in the north as well. You read about in the mid 1300s. We're going to get onto it a bit later, but I was shocked. I was reading about one of the most famous condottieri, who was actually an Englishman named John Hawkwood, and this gives you an idea as well of the sort of at this time the sort of reputation this area had. If you wanted to make a fortune or something like that. And John Hawkwood was making something like 10,000, 15,000 florins a year, maybe more. It was like 20,000 florins. It was some absurd amount of money, and bear in mind, this is, you get like 10 florins a year, maybe, if you're some sort of skilled laborer, a florin's a gold coin. And so it's just a maddeningly, there's just this huge surge of wealth in the north. Sorry?
It's almost obscene in scale.
Oh yes, but of course this does lead on to this massive increase of wealth does lead on to the cultural points of the Renaissance that we all love. The art, I hate to say it, but it couldn't have really happened without this sort of mercantile activity to support.
Yeah, the mercantile activity, and then the patronage of the arts and that sort of stuff. I mean,
Yes.
we have to consider it like the likes of Michelangelo, for instance, were patronized by the de Medici family in
Well, it's
Venice.
just it's such a febrile situation, you know. There's not. I mean, there are many men in this period, you know, like Federico de Montefeltro. I suppose he's slightly later, but he's one of these condottieri, and you know he fights his way to power and becomes a duke, you know. And there's a number of examples like this, and so there's this sort of nouveau riche, I suppose, you know, not only in the mercantile sense, but also in the sense of we have this new aristocracy coming up, and of course they desperately want prestige, right? And so one of the strategies I've already mentioned is, you know, they will try and you know, hark back to their Roman descent. But another good strategy is to, you know, build a fine church, or I mean, you know, that's always been the way, you know. I mean, you will build a fine church, or build a new plaza or piazza, or and this in a way sort of by the very act of doing this, it legitimizes you, you know. And so I do think that was a very strong motivation, you know, in the same way, you know, a politician in ancient Rome would build a temple or something like this, you know. It's a way of stamping your authority.
And what's
In
interesting
contrast,
too is
sorry, just because I really want to get onto this slightly later. Just one last point I want to touch on, a point Columba made, which is about new money. Of course, one of the issues that, because I really, again, southern Italy is going to take a back seat from here on out. I just want to finish this point. Southern Italy,
don't make me cry. I am.
Yes, southern Italy, of course. Not only is it, you know, not the center of the nouveau riche, but it's constantly at the the center of the dynastic conflicts essentially in Italy. So from the Sicilian Vespers in the late 13th century all the way up until the late 14th century, the Aragonese of Sicily and the Angevin Capetian dynasty in Naples are routinely at odds. Again, to make it even worse in terms of the diminishment of the kingdom of Naples post the demise of the Hohenstaufens is literally a vassal where they nominally owe, you know, their allegiance, as essentially the liege lord of Naples is now the Pope. But again, to make this even worse, there are several branches of the House of Anjou. So we have a Hungarian branch, as I alluded to a couple of streams ago, and of course we have junior branches within that dynasty as well. So Naples is this constant scene of dynastic infighting and fighting, of course, with the Aragonese, which will culminate in the deposition of the Angevin dynasty in 1442 with disastrous results moving on.
It does make a lot more sense if I look at it like that, because there's one thing that you know, I'm not an expert on the wars in this period, but one thing which always puzzled me, at least to some extent, is why Naples didn't ever make you know, a stronger attempt to sort of expand or expand its power and control relative to, you know, the chaotic smaller states that are surrounding it. But I suppose the situation was just too unstable and there was too much rivalry going on.
And it is something of a tragedy too. Just like very quickly, Apostolic,
Sure.
just because we're on southern Italy specifically, is that if you look back through the ages, I'm talking like from this point and backwards, you know, you look at the kingdom of Roger II, you look at the theme of Sicily, you look at the Roman province of Sicily, you look at the Greek and sort of Carthaginian cities of Sicily. Sicily had been this renowned place of quite considerable wealth, of wealthy trade, of considerable agricultural productivity. I mean, remember, Sicily was classical Rome, Republican Rome's first breadbasket. And Sicily had been renowned through the ages of being not only a strategic key for the Mediterranean, but also a place of considerable wealth and of a valuable possession for anyone who was able to take it. And what happens really from this Renaissance period onwards is there's this sort of inevitable and this transition of power and wealth to the north that never changes. To the extent where, when you look at the time of unification in the mid 1800s and up until, you know, the around World War I and, you know, the middle of last century, southern Italy is almost reduced to an impoverished part of the country. It is very agrarian and it's still able to be productive from an agricultural standpoint, but it's not really wealthy again, and it is one of the more backward parts of Europe. And it's an astonishing change from where it found itself in the previous millennia. But that process starts at this time frame also.
Absolutely, I think that's a good point to leave off. Now, Columba, this is your wheelhouse, so to speak. So I've included certain figures. Another figure which I haven't included an image here is talking about another famous Italian friar, Saint Thomas Aquinas. And again, just to link this idea that I don't believe there was some dramatic rebirth, so to speak, in the fashion of a Jules Michelet, in the sense that we were talking in our House of Capet stream regarding the birth of the Cluniac movement and the Cistercian movement, and how all of this, burgeoning intellectual activity had begun through the monasteries. And of course, this is shown through scholasticism, the movement which attempts to, more than anything else, harmonize the classical scholarship with, again, the fundamental rubric of Christian teaching. And of course, this is exemplified by St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologica. Of course, at the same time, we have St. Francis of Assisi. The interesting thing, of course, about St. Francis of Assisi, to anyone who doesn't know, is that St. Francis of Assisi venerated and made poverty a central virtue of holiness. However, upon his death, that idea is completely ignored by the by a large part of the Franciscan orders, and the Franciscans become, like the Dominicans, like the Cistercians, one of the largest and wealthiest monastic movements operating in Italy at this time. And again, a major repository of knowledge.
And those Franciscans who decry this new state of affairs are brutally persecuted as well. They're called heretics and schismatics. I believe
this is the Telly movement of
the sort of little Francises or the little brothers, and then their idea is the wealth of the church is a disgrace, which perhaps they're not entirely wrong, but this is just a period of intense intellectual activity, all pretty much taking place within the church or under its aegis. You have Aquinas, who is of course synthesizing the church's teachings and Aristotelian philosophy in this exciting new way. You have St. Francis, who starts a whole new way of sort of looking at religiosity, looking at nature. His most famous works are the Canticle of the Sun and praising nature and considering your fellow beasts, birds and beasts, as your brothers, brother fish, brother cow, and there's also this lovely sort of jauntiness to it, right, which comes out of, last time, as you mentioned, we talked about the troubadours, right, and this sort of romantic culture, the culture of romance that had been built up in the preceding centuries. Francis is directly inspired by this. We are told that he was fond of singing troubadour songs, and in many ways he sort of and Kenneth Clark brings this out wonderfully in his documentary. There's this sense in which he transfers these chivalric notions to this sort of higher philosophy. I believe he's even quoted as saying, "I have made poverty my lady," and so there's this idea of this utter subjection to the lady, and these romantic notions being transferred to the pursuit of truth, to the pursuit of God, to the worship of the Virgin Mary. There are many wonderful sonnets and poems to the Virgin Mary. And then, of course, Dante. You mentioned the Cluniac movement and the Cistercians. I actually, on that show, read out a quote criticizing the sort of cluttered, luxurious style, and that quote was from Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. Well, if you read Dante, Bernard of Clairvaux is one of his guides. You have Beatrice, you have Virgil, and then you have Bernard of Clairvaux, which demonstrates his deep respect for the achievements of the monastics. And then also in terms of art as well. You have huge seismic developments. The two greatest painters. One of them is from Siena and one of them is from Florence. In the 1200s are Duccio and Cimabue. Cimabue people might have heard of because they actually found another painting by Cimabue recently. Some old French woman had it in her shed or something, and it sold for an ungodly amount of money. And they basically worked in an expanded Byzantine style. You have the gold backgrounds, you have the Theotokos, all of these I suppose tropes and ways of doing things that had stayed relatively steady for centuries, literally centuries. And then you have with the advent of this new attitude that is coming around, especially in the north, perhaps because of their the chaos of the situation, the increased sort of political freedom or what have you, we have these new ways of looking at things, and then we have Giotto, who I mean, Giotto's most famous achievement is the Scrovegni, or the Arena Chapel, which I think is in Florence. It was done in around 1305, the decoration, and Scrovegni was a moneylender, right? He's one of these nouveau riches that we're talking about that wants to justify his position, you know. And so he gets Giotto and his students in to decorate, and it's just an incredible shift from what has come before. I mean the use of you know, perspective, natural figures. It's no longer these cluttered medieval compositions you will have. I mean, anyone look up the you know, the Kiss of Judas that he done. You know, you will have the spears and the torches crossing each other up top. You will have, you know, cloaks being thrown open, and this sense of movement, which is just totally unprecedented. You know, and Vasari. I mean, you know, if you read Vasari, the famous art historian, he gushes about Giotto. He calls him a genius, you know, the greatest artist of our age, who you know, laid the foundations for everyone who came after him. And it's hard to say that he's wrong, because it really hadn't been done before outside of I mean, you know, you can go to some of the manuscripts perhaps in the late 1200s, the early 1300s, you know, in the courts of Burgundy, you know, places, you know, like the Très Riche hours or the Très Riche hours, the very rich hours. But these are tiny little books that use these sort of wonderful techniques, and Giotto takes it and just goes crazy with it and expands it, and this new style becomes sensational. And when, you know, you have St. Francis dying, and as you mentioned, you do have this sort of total you know, ignoring of everything that he stood for. You have this fantastic cathedral or church built to St. Francis in Assisi, and Giotto decorates it. All the greatest artists decorate it with this grand new style. And then Dante's the same. I mean, Dante's work has been called the Summa in verse, you know, because he takes all of these this Aristotelian synthesis of Aquinas and puts it in this wonderful poetry. But Dante is also heavily inspired by the, you know, the courtly love, these sentiments of chivalry. I mean, his first major work is La Vita Nuova, you know, and it's about his love for this woman called Beatrice. You know, he says he meets her when they were both 9 years old, and he fell in love immediately. And even though he got promised to another woman every time he saw her, you know, it's just this sort of extremely intense you know, love poetry over years, and it's totally a part of the culture of its time, but he's also bridging this gap in so many ways. You know, he is bringing in these new concepts as well. There's a sort of respect for an increasing respect for I suppose man and his faculties, which is coming about at this time. There's an increasing respect for nature, which doesn't so much come out in Dante, but more is his immediate successors, if you will. I mean, people like Petrarch, who might have actually knew Dante, people like Boccaccio, and you know, there's a famous story about Petrarch that he went to go and climb a mountain, just for the view. And this Petrarch claims that he was the first man to do this since antiquity, you know, because it just most people just would have seen it as trouble, I suppose. And so he climbs the mountain and he comes down and he has this new determination, because he says he went up there to admire the sights, but then he remembered this quote, I think from the Bible. And then he gets this sense that he needs to turn inwards. He needs to turn into himself and the human faculties. And then you get the insane resurgence of classical texts, the vibrant literary culture that comes around. And all of these guys are writing in the vernacular, right? Boccaccio is writing in the vernacular, and this is an international phenomenon as well. I mean, Boccaccio knew Chaucer, you know, and Chaucer's Canterbury Tales are basically an English version of the Decameron. You know, it's the exact same endeavor, you know, and they're bringing in this sort of this new humanism that's sort of nascent. But I mean, the idea that it isn't deeply linked to strong religious belief and religious principles is patently absurd. And anyone who ignores that is being dishonest and has some sort of agenda. I mean, frankly.
I think that's a wonderful and cohesive summary of the burgeoning intellectual thought and artistic development during this time. There's one point I really want to underwrite, which you made, which is about writers utilizing the vernacular. Well, just because again, this is broadly
define vernacular, I suppose.
Yes, this is broadly this is broadly a stream about identity, of course, and of course, linguistic development is a fundamental component of that. So, from the collapse of the Roman Empire in Italy, Latin increasingly disappears as a means of everyday communication. It increasingly becomes associated with administration, law, and of course, ecclesia, the church. And local Italians begin speaking regional dialects of Vulgar Latin, and even those dialects are divided into major sub-dialects. So, for example, in the south, you have the Dalmatian dialect and the Italo-Dalmatian dialect. In the north, you have the Gallo-Italian dialect, which is, even got this Celtic substratum, which existed all the way back before the Romans even colonized this regions, 200 years before Christ. Why, and again, in course of the history of Italy, we have, of course, the Langobards, the German-speaking Langobards, who eventually, begin speaking Proto-Germanic, and they become eventually assimilated into speaking this everyday form of Vulgar Italian, whether it be, of course, the standard strain in Benevento is going to be very different from the vernacular in Pavia. However, why this period is so significant and why this, I think, substantiates your earlier point, Marcus, about the creation, why this period is so essential in terms of creating a sense of Italian national identity, even though, again, imbued with this fundamental sense of regionalism, is that standard Italian in its recognizable form originates from this period. We have, and this, of course, is really the dominance of one vernacular over all the others, which is, of course, the Florentine Tuscan vernacular. It's basically established in the 12th century, and by the 13th century, we have the grammar and we have the lexicon, i.e., we have all of the the basic words which will then grow and form the modern Italian language.
And Dante was at the core of this. I just wanted to add briefly that in France, I don't think it's still, the term is still used, but a couple centuries ago, even a century ago, it was somewhat common to call Italian "le langue de Dante." The tongue of Dante, or the language of Dante, which shows you how intimately associated it was with this small school of individuals.
Yes, Dante,
and even in Italian, that refer to it as lingua Alighieri, the language of Alighieri.
Oh, I like that, lingua Alighieri. That's nice.
And of course, Alighieri, of course, being the surname of Dante, as shown on the slide. And of course, he basically sets the standard for canonical poetic Italian through this dialect, and it becomes, of course, lapped up by this new Italian elite. You could say the nouveau riche, the ones who aren't in ecclesia or, again, administration. This cultural elite is, again, almost as a point of necessity, having to understand and absorb this new Florentine dialect, and that again is why Florence is so essential to the creation of the Renaissance, in the sense it is the Florentine dialect which conquers the rest of Italy during this period.
Yes, and that wouldn't have happened without the Florentines' massive wealth as well.
Yes,
and it's not just in terms of wealth, but I mean it's a deeper level of sort of domination that the Florentines have. I mean their currency, right? I mean, the florin becomes one of the most desired currencies anywhere in the Mediterranean, because it's reliable, and people have a lot of trust in the
florin almost becomes ubiquitous in Europe for centuries afterwards.
Yes, I mean the word is sort of synonymous with money in many places for a long time.
Yeah, of course. Well, the interesting thing is, if you look at the term florin, the name of Florence in Italian is Firenze. The name foreigners give Firenze is Florence. So the fact that they call the florin the non-Italian name for Firenze goes to show you the impact that the currency has, when our phrase that we have for it is the non-Italian phrase of it, if you get what I mean.
That's a good point. It sort of demonstrates their aspirations.
It would have been a French or an English person who, in text, has called this currency.
Well, actually, it's in my view, it's most likely to be German, because of course, in German, Florenz is the direct translation.
There you go, German.
And of course, this moves on to the next slide. But just one point before I get to the economic angle of this, so just to say that this conquest by the Florentine dialect isn't even complete today. Italy is still very linguistically diverse. All of these regional dialects still exist, and of course, within the Gallo-Cisalpine Italian dialects, as I mentioned, we still have millions of people who speak a dialect known, whether it be Ligurian, Piedmontese, Lombard, or Emilian. Of course, the Venetians speak their own separate dialect, which is part
and
of
they're
the
quite
same language group.
and they're quite dramatically different, right?
Mhm.
Like, I mean, I've been told by Italians, from the very north, that if you go to the very south, you'll have quite a tough time understanding people. I mean,
But of course, you mentioned the South, Columba. Of course, there is a lingering Angevin Norman influence, which goes back to the fact that the Neapolitan and Sicilian dialects. I mean, in some cases, I think it's in Calabria, you even have a significant dialect of Italian which is Greek influenced. Yet otherwise, you have Occitan influenced words in the Neapolitan dialect as well. But before we go on, Marcus, there's a anecdote you want to give us there, isn't there?
Yeah. So, for instance, when my grandmother was educated in Italy through the 1930s, leading up to the outbreak of World War II, for instance. And funnily enough, it was under Mussolini's regime where Italian actually became standardized. It wasn't, in fact, standardized following the Risorgimento and unification. It was actually a policy of Mussolini's. And it didn't really, well, how can I say? It worked insofar that people started adopting a common Italian. But like both of you have rightly said, this regionalism still continues today. You can travel to Messina or to Palermo and still speak Sicilian with the natives, and they will understand you. And actually, quite often, they will default to speaking it amongst themselves. I, strangely enough, went to a barber shop in a little place called Cefalù on the north coast 2 years ago, and me, with my bumbling, broken sort of half Italian, managed to communicate what I wanted, and I got a wonderful haircut and a shave. But I was taken
they're meant to have
aback by
great
the fact
barbers.
oh, actually, they do. The barbers are exceptional. But then I was the what the gentleman in the barbershop was saying was, più sono bello della Australiano, basically saying the boy from Australia. And for those who've picked up or who know Sicilian or have heard of it, the use of D and the U's in Sicilian are one of the things I actually did derive from Arabic. And it's funny how centuries and centuries and centuries after this influence, those things have remained embedded in language and embedded in culture to a degree. And for those who do like Italian food and what have you, if you are familiar, for instance, with Italian desserts, you're familiar with the dolce, you're familiar with cannelloni, or you're familiar with the Italian marzipan or whatever, that there is an expression of when the Arabs first brought, say, sugar and citrus to
Yes.
Italy. Whereas in the north, if you get desserts up in Torino, or what the French call Turin, you get French little patisseries. The expressions of regionalism are so different from one end to the other. It's extraordinary, and it's very apparent in language.
Yes,
Sorry
it
for that
is.
slight divergence, AM, but I thought
No,
you'd
I
like
think
it.
it also really underlines. Sorry, I was just going to say, I think it really underlines the brilliance of Dante as well. That with all these divisions, everyone's like, okay, well, I mean, I'll accept him as my guy,
Yeah, and just on that basis too, that the Italian that was taught from Mussolini's period onwards till like the present day is essentially a synthesis. It is a combination of Florentine Italian and Roman Italian,
And
what they call laziale, and it's the
one-
combination of those two that have formed the modern language.
Indeed. And you mentioned, the fascists' involvement here. Just one point I would like to make before we get on AM is that there was actually a plan when the war started to go really badly for Mussolini and the fascists. They had this sort of mountain redoubt that had been built, for a sort of final last stand. There was actually a plan proposed to go and get Dante's bones and bring them there as a sort of a sort of rallying point for the Italian people, which I just again underlines the sort of importance, I suppose.
Yes, and yes, absolutely, Columba. There's one point, because again, you're bringing up all these interesting points, and we keep dragging on. But this is good. This is a conversation. This isn't a lecture.
Sorry,
which is
sorry about this.
Which is your point of Torino or Turin. Obviously, one area which we haven't really talked about at all, which is going to play a major role in the 19th century, is the dynasty of Savoy. Savoy, of course, despite having significant Italian holdings in Torino and Cuneo, and of course Nice, of course its center of power wasn't even in Italy. It was at Chambray, which is in modern-day France, in Savoy. And so again, this multinational influence, and again, this dynasty, it retains this, you can say this fundamental aspect where they have a French-speaking court, but again, ruling over a predominantly Italian population all the way up until the reincorporation of these territories into France during the 1860s. So moving on to the economic aspect. Colombo, is there anything you want to speak rather broadly about the developments of Italian banking?
Oh goodness! I mean, I'm not an expert, but I know that once a civilization becomes more complex and states become more stable, this stuff tends to come along, right? I mean, it seems to be unfortunately necessary, and of course, we all know that the church forbade usury, the lending of money at interest. But it does seem to be the case that, at least quite broadly, and especially in the north, it was sort of quietly allowed as long as it wasn't too extravagant.
Well, you mentioned a very important point, which is that again, as you can see on this little image here, I have an image here of a Italian counting house, and of course, it's part of a treatise on avarice, which is an important point to note.
Excellent.
Yes, well, again, when we talk about banking, of course, we have the beginning of the merchant banks, and one of their first things is to organize the funding of grain as a commodity, so Italian cities would be fed. Many of the people who originally organized these merchant banks, of course, weren't native Italians or Christians. They were, of course, Jews. After the creation of the Crusades, many Jews, again, given over by the economic opportunities offered within Italy, and of course, due to the fact that Christians were again forbidden from the sin of usury, used this as an opportunity to come over and establish all of these merchant banks. In addition to the fact that Jews couldn't invariably hold territory or land, and established land holdings and dynasties throughout most of Italy. So they were naturally drawn to these cities and were, you could say, influential in the creation of the piazza culture, and especially beyond that, beyond the creation of the merchant banks, we have the beginning of credit in general and insurance underwriting functions provided by the Jews, and of course then you have the idea of the court Jew, the person within the court, within the establishment.
The Hofjude, is that the German word?
Yeah.
Also, AM at this time, just quickly, because you're on this subject, we also have the invention of double entry accounting, which was devised by a gentleman by the name of Luca Pacioli, which really
could somebody explain that to my lack of economical knowledge? What is double entry for a child?
Double entry bookkeeping, to my understanding, is that you actually have rather than a single page, let's say a single entry book in which a person's accounts and their debits and their credits are entered, for instance, right? Which means that this is my understanding, but I could be wrong, but that means that only at any one place do they know what the status of a person's bank account, or not bank account, but the amount of credit they hold in a bank, or the amount of holdings,
gotcha. So you can have an account somewhere else. I see.
So basically, let's just say you open an account in Firenze, for instance, but then you want to lend out of Padua or Cremona or another city, then your main entry sits in where your account is resided, and then you have a secondary essentially a second entry book kept elsewhere, and they always correlate between the books, so that way you can have a more how should I say, up to date feedback on what your financial status is at any given time, and it also is an initial prevention also from fraud.
Of course,
absolutely, yeah.
I mean, I was going to say, I mean, people listening might be surprised by these sorts of things, but it does seem to be quite a common development in the Renaissance, and that many of these things are quietly countenanced because I suppose they believe it's for the greater good. It's part of this new culture. I mean, you see this with all sorts of things at this time. Offenses that we would expect someone to get burned for, or even in the centuries later, once you get to the 1500s, they would be maybe burned or executed. At this time, they'll get a slap on the wrist, they'll get a fine, which at times comforts me and at times makes me wary.
Another thing I just want to say, just on the question you asked as well, I believe one of the fundamental parts of double entry bookkeeping as well, in terms of the locality thing, is also the fact that you have the first creation of specific ledgers for credit and for debts, for drawings and for deposits and what have you, and the ability to actually maintain a structure of your account so that at any given, let's just say it's calculated at the end of every month, then you sort of know if you're in profit or loss. And it's this calculus where you sort of have to account for every dollar that you either deposit or take out of the account. And then essentially it allows for the first time in I suppose Western history, but I suppose history broadly speaking, where you actually have this ability to extrapolate costs from month to month, or deposits or expenditures from month to month, and then therefore you could say you have the beginnings of data entry, where then you can then extrapolate economic activity going forward, and then you can sort of you can actually forecast, which is something which had never been done in economics before.
No, there's a lot of in terms of the economics. It's quite remarkable, some of the things. I mean, it's slightly later than this in the 1400s, or in the late 1400s. There was there was a banker, and there's a quote in one of his works where he's literally trying to justify, he says there's no more liberal work than making money, because he can then spend it on all of these fine arts. But there's actually a quote in there where he says the value is our labor, the goods are merely transferred. And this is in the 1400s, I mean, centuries before you get to Smith and Marx and what have you. It's very interesting.
It's the genesis, in a sense, of economic theory, in a sense.
Not in a sense, it is.
Yeah.
It really is. Yeah. But I mean, and also the point that you mentioned, AM, about the fact that these aren't Jews, right? These are Christians. That allows these families, the Medicis and being the most famous, to establish themselves, right? Whereas for the Jews, there's always the threat of expulsion or persecution or the confiscation of your goods. And I mean, apart from that, I mean, banking in and of itself is quite a volatile business, shall we say? I mean, there are many examples of influential banking families in this period who go bankrupt, right? I mean, they're totally, and their influence is totally destroyed. This happens multiple times.
Yes, one specific, one specific, obviously, family which goes bankrupt is the, I believe, the Bardi family, which later marry into the Medici. I believe it's
yes, the Medicis. I believe the Medicis sort of use their connections in a way,
Well, it's rather, again, they're this prestigious banking family which have long preceded the Medicis. The Medicis only set up the Medici Bank in 1397 under Giovanni de Medici, as you can see here. And the Bardi family are, again, a much older banking family. And again, it's bringing this connection with an older dynasty to establish what was, you could say, a very upstart house, especially during the time of Giovanni and the early time of Cosimo de Medici.
Yes.
In terms of other developments, talked about, again, Marcus, the introduction of double entry accounting. Of course, we have the creation of the first foreign exchanges, and of course the first
and they're
state
all
banks.
over the place as well. I mean, there's one in London.
Well, in this time in particular, again, relating this back to Italy, in 1156, we have the creation of the first foreign exchange, which is in Genoa. And the first state bank, of course, is the Bank of Venice, which props up, again, all of this major sort of beguiling trade as a result of the massive expansion of trade as a result of the Crusades. Again, the Crusades are almost fundamental in terms of the creation of the banking industry as an ability to finance this. On the one hand,
which in a form still exists today, just
yes.
for the record.
On the one hand, you have, kings such as Henry II of England actually using the Templars and Hospitallers as his creditors, essentially, in order to fight the Crusades. But again, this is going back to the idea we discussed on the House of Capet stream, which is the idea that these crusading orders are also directly facilitating not only the financial management of these massive access, not only are they facilitating the conveyance of these pilgrims from Italy into the Levant, but they're also financing the operations.
Yes, and they're also building up the capital necessary to have a successful banking operation. Right?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
There's an explanation too for that foreign exchange thing in Genoa, by the way, because we have sort of here and there touched on the thalassocratic merchant republics that have been established, particularly in the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade, in which you might say that these Western entities kind of picked at the carcass or the remnants of the East Roman Empire. And think if you take into account that Venice had taken into its sphere Crete and the Negroponte, and obviously a significant quarter in Constantinople, and the Genoese, we're in the Crimea, we're in the Sea of Azov, had conquered a couple of fortresses along the Black Sea, I believe, Sinope for a time and Heraclea Pontica. Ergo, they were bringing in relatively large quantities of currency that was not their own. So in order to be able to, you might say, transfer that currency into usable currency for them, which would have been, I suppose, florins at a point in time, they would have had a counting and changing house. And it's the establishment of these thalassocratic merchant republics of these Italian cities that stimulates that necessity. You know how they sort of say that necessity is the driver of invention, some other invention? Well, they needed to do it. I mean, they're trading with the Mongols, they're trading with the Golden Horde, they're trading with the nascent Ottomans and the Mamluks and all these other entities in the East. So it would make sense that a counting and money trading house would be founded in Italy, of all places.
Absolutely. I think, Columba, there's one point I really want to, you emphasize again the countenance of Christian bankers. How this happens, again, it's important to associate that the origins of banking isn't immediately associated with the Florentines. Invariably, it's the Lombards and obviously the area around Milan, which are associated with the first Christian bankers. And this is a process that begins in the 13th century. And they come up with a rather creative way to avoid charging interest, because of course usury interest is the fundamental sin, whereby they insure those loans against possible loss of injury. And it's the payment of the insurance that gets around the proviso for
I see.
Yes, for the interest. Slippery. And this becomes, the beginning of the so-called Pope's usurers, so to speak. And again, the Bardi family, which play an important part in.
I've heard a phrase for this, and I believe it's I think they call it a refundable stipend. It's a very creative terminology.
I thought you were going to suggest that something along the lines of in the early days, perhaps something along the lines of the Arab system, where you just pay a flat fee to deposit your money, right? I believe that's how things are done. Yeah.
But I love the linguistic sort of wriggle room that comes in. Refundable
It's a lot of that, isn't it? There's a lot of that.
It's magnificent. Yeah. Sorry, continue. Apostle.
Well, no, this gets. Other than that, I said, creating the first state bank. Of course, Genoa would also set up its own state bank in the form of the Bank of St. George. But this is where we have the arrival of the Medicis, in particular Giovanni de Medici. Of course, he's not the first Medici banker, but he does set up the Medici Bank in 1397. I think it's important to note again, he's proffering of the decline of these once great Florentine trading families, such as not just the Bardi but also the Peruzzi family. And the ascendancy of Giovanni de Medici is actually made through. Again, this is the follow-in into our next conversation, which is talking about the Western Schism, because he originally backs one of the Pisan popes, later known to posterity as the anti-pope John the 23rd, and eventually, sponsors his glorious tomb in the Florentine baptistry. In addition to being part of a select group to oversee the creation of, I think it's who designed the door to the baptistry in Florence.
It's either Brunelleschi or Ghiberti.
No, Ghiberti. Brunelleschi designed the dome. Ghiberti designed the doors to the baptistry, and it's after this, during the Council of Constance, which ends the Western Schism, that Giovanni again moves beyond John the 23rd, who is part of the initiative behind this council, supports Martin V, and it's not actually in Florence, the city itself, where the Medici starts, making this vast amount of this vast international empire. It's Rome, and as a subsidiary to that, it's also Venice. It's the idea that they are establishing themselves as the primary bankers to the popes, offering a personal service to them. And again, this is something which we'll see consistently. And of course, the association with the House of Medici and the papacy goes way beyond this, to the point that they will provide, I believe, 2 or 3 popes. Am I correct?
Yes, I think it's 3. But yes, because they can do things like if somebody defaults on their debts, they can get them excommunicated things like this. It's ruthless stuff. Not our finest hour, I'm afraid.
Talking about ruthless, this brings us on to what was happening in the papacy during this point. Obviously, we've had the Western Schism, and we've had the Babylonian captivity in Avignon. And there had been many attempts of the popes to come back and establish some form of authority over Rome. And then there's this rather serendipitous moment for the Roman aristocracy and the Roman public. Gregory XI arrives in Rome for a visit and then makes the decision to return to Avignon, but he dies during the process. So he's actually died in Rome, the first pope to die in Rome for nearly a century at this point.
I would actually just add to that quickly, because there's some debate about the reasons why Gregory wanted to come back, and as you say, there were these other sort of abortive attempts under Urban. I believe it was Urban V. Apparently when I was researching this, one of the strong impetuses for Gregory's coming south to Rome was Catherine of Siena.
So no, absolutely, I agree with that. I think the reason I've intentionally sort of underplayed that is simply that in the long term, this actually results in the Western Schism rather than the triumphant return of the papacy, which still lasts a lot longer. But yes, I think important to emphasize that Saint Catherine of Siena does again start this unique correspondence with Gregory XI, imploring him to come back and establish the Civitas Dei, the city of God, essentially, the Caput Mundi. But I think in terms of again the historical implications of this is that this doesn't end too well for the papacy, because you have an election essentially backed by the sword, backed by the Roman population, who want to essentially insist that the cardinals remain in Rome.
And this comes back to the sort of the Cola di Rienzi, this idea that the populace in Rome at this time, over this period, there's a sort of a fervor and a dangerousness about the population, so much so that they can influence events in this way.
Well, so much so, I mean, invariably, every time a pope died, there would be riots during Sede Vacante, and of course, Sede Vacante during the period where there is no pope. And invariably, when a pope was elected, there was this expectation that he would shower the population of Rome with tribute and gold in order basically to sate their bloodlust, because they believe, the loss of the pope basically meant the loss of stability in the city and would invariably lead to looting, especially when this happened in the Roman summer. Where
it would seem that old habits die hard for the urban Romans.
It would.
And so this leads, of course, to the shotgun election of Urban VI, and the cardinals, after the fact, believe that this election is invalid because this was an election again precipitated by the threat of violence.
And apparently, so Urban himself was had some character flaws, shall we say?
Yeah, there was maybe interest of self-preservation to not have Urban VI become pope. So they elect Clement VII as pope. And of course, he declares along the previous election invalid. But considering there's already been a pope declared by the College of Cardinals, you now have a fundamental issue over the concept of, you can say, even sovereignty within the church, because the College of Cardinals has made two popes, and they do not have.
You've had anti-popes before, but this is the first time where they've within a short space of time been elected by the same body of cardinals, and so it's just a total mess.
And so it immediately leads to conflict all across Europe over, as you can see on this map, who is the rightful pope. Of course, the Clement VII faction moved back to Avignon, and the Urban VI faction remained in Rome, and we have the creation of a Roman papacy and the creation of a Avignon papacy. And of course, this issue they try to resolve. I mean, at one point, the French even try and compel the Avignon pope to resign to heal the schism due to all of the addition.
And that's their guy.
Yes, exactly. In terms of how much division this is causing in the fabric of Christendom. And of course, to make matters even worse, you have the Council of Pisa, which is convoked to try and end the schism. And of course, it implores upon both papal candidates to resign in favor of a new election. They don't. So the Council of Pisa instead declares them both heretics and schismatic, and elects a third pope. First Alexander V, and then of course John the 23rd at the initiative of the Medici family. And so it when we talk about the Council of Constance, which happens 5 years after the Council of Pisa, it's the insistence of King Sigismund of the Romans and Bohemia, which we discussed in our previous stream, and the initiative of the Pisan Pope John XXIII. And what basically enables his success is because of course it doesn't start successfully, is that the Roman Pope Gregory the XII opts to resign, and this creates a moral legitimacy for the council, even though the Avignon Pope Benedict XIII and later his successor Clement VIII will not accept the council. This is a unification of the Pisan and the Roman aspects of it, and they rally behind one of the most prominent members of the Italian aristocracy, Martin V of the Colonna dynasty, of course, which would be one of the two major families to pick up after the deposition of and death of Boniface VIII. And in 1429, you have the death of Clement VIII, and for a couple of years, Martin V is the sole pope in Christendom. So when you have the election of Eugenius is the sole pope, and the Western Schism has been solved. However, this is important to note that this time has caused a fundamental damage to the conception of papal supremacy, especially, of course, added to the fact that when you have two popes both claiming universal authority over Christendom, combined with all this, expectation built up from the Gregorian reforms that he's not just the first among equals, but he is, again, imbued with this idea of papal infallibility at the same time. It becomes again this idea of conciliarism, this idea of where does the sovereignty of the church lie? Does it rely in the pope, or does it rely in the collective power of all the priests of the church? Is the council?
Yes, is the council superior to the pope?
Yes, de Maistre talks about this.
Yes. A pope,
yes, de Maistre talks about this extensively in the pope, but it's again the idea whether the council is superior or the pope is superior, and this is an issue which one of the people behind the Council of Constance, John Gerson, is again part of this conciliarist movement at the same time. So the first Renaissance popes, so to speak, are plagued with this idea that, in addition to, talk about a decline in the fortunes of all these factions. On the one hand, the empire has basically gone through a 200-year on-off interregnum, while at the same time, the Pope, in addition to having been absent from Italy throughout most of this time, and basically the puppets of the French king, upon his return, there is now a fundamental movement, theological movement within Christendom itself, 100 years before the Reformation, to demote the Pope and elevate the collective body of the church above the Pope.
People like Wycliffe, right?
Yes, exactly, and of course this is the creation of the Lollard heresy, and again in England, of course, Jan Hus in Bohemia at the same time. So the fundamental fabric of Christendom, way apart from this idea of one universal Christian authority, all of this is beginning to break down, and it's really under the first pope. So we have Nicholas V, then of course we have Calixtus, who was the first Borgia pope and the uncle to Rodrigo Borgia, who we'll talk about when we revisit this topic in the Italian Wars, and Pius II, who finally resolved the idea that there can be no appeal over the Pope to a council, and the fact that when it comes to the election of an anti-pope, only a elected pope can basically resign or declare an election, by another authority invalid. And this temporarily, resolves this crisis. And of course, we have the 100 years of theological development, which will culminate in the Council of Trent, which again affirms the idea of papal supremacy. But for a time, from the 15th century, had potentially not been for the Council of Constance, you could have had a complete breakdown in the hierarchical nature of the Catholic Church.
Yes, it was a very precarious moment, and it was very widespread. I know this is about Italy, but one point that I'd just like to make quickly is that these issues were, and many people will look at it and say, oh, well, these issues were really just being cynically used. And I would say in many cases, these were very deeply held principles. People really cared about these issues, but these issues were used as part of the political programs of various characters. You'll notice on this map that Scotland supports Avignon, right? Scotland, of course, you have the Auld Alliance, right? Scotland's allied with France at the time against England. This is the time of the Wars of Independence, and so Scotland's allied with Avignon, and indeed, you had Edward I, who had to put down the revolt in Wales, right? And you had the Welsh Prince Owain Glyndwr, and he also supported the Avignon papacy, whereas Edward supported Rome. And so you can see how these issues were folded into the the sort of political and military contests of the time as well.
It's safe to say that as in many such instances in history, that it's cynical and often wrong of a modern person to say that the convictions did not exist. I think they most
Yes,
certainly did. But
that's the scar of the Marxists right there.
but as always exists in a time where, you know, your independence and your existence as a city state or a nation can literally be lost on the battlefield in a day. Convictions must be seen through the context of a prevailing scenario or a situation or a circumstance for a given people or a given country, and this map is evidence of that. I mean, it's not to say that
Yeah, I
people
mean, no, you're right.
are
You're right.
nothing but cynical, but convictions sit within the prism of considerations beyond conviction as well. And
Yeah, I mean, convictions are also
better
changed by
accept that.
events, right? I
Mm,
mean, we've
correct.
talked about Dante and his
Mm,
shifts, you know. I mean, and when you have because you know, I mean, after Dante is exiled from Florence, right? Because the whites and the blacks start fighting each other. You know, the whites try to get back in, but there's all sorts of then infighting amongst the whites and betrayals
yeah.
there. And then you have Henry VII, and Dante, with this disgust that he has of, you know, I mean the papal politics that he's seen, the struggles in the Guelph faction, he changes his mind, and he approaches this new idea of a sort of you know, how can we reconcile these two visions, basically, you know.
Yeah,
And his view
right.
changes, and then he writes, you know, his most famous political treatise, De Monarchia, you know, on monarchy, where he advocates, you know, the universal rule temporally of the emperor and the universal rule spiritually of the Pope, and he tries to thread through these things in a way that, you know, I must give him credit for. I think he argues very well. And again, also that same work, I mean, is full of Aristotelian and Platonic philosophy, talking about you know, the end to which government is tending, and so you see these philosophic and political things coming through, which of course, I mean, you know, in the Renaissance, you know, give it a couple hundred years, and this sort of stuff will blossom into Machiavelli and Balthazar with the courtier and the prince, and these sort of how-to manuals on how to rule, which I suppose
Indeed.
in and of themselves are a sort of product of the cynicism that had been created.
And you think that,
Sorry, Marcus. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and the thing is too with Machiavelli specifically is that his writings and his rationale pertaining that he conveys in his materials and his books has such an influence on the Western mind in the way that all politicians and all people who interact with the public sphere thereafter use in varying ways and with varying methods, sort of utilize his writings and his explanation for things up until the present day. You know, we actually have a word, and regrettably, it's always used in the pejorative, and I don't think that's always fair, because I actually consider Machiavelli to have been a Florentine patriot. And I don't think all of his work was cynical, but for instance, we have the word Machiavellian. And if his works didn't have a profound effect as they have done, then that wouldn't be the case.
Well, I mean, his works had a very profound effect, even within a very short space of time. I mean, relatively speaking, of course. I mean, you know, you can go to oh God, you can go to Richard III, where he makes the famous and you know, that's the 1600s Shakespeare, right? Not that long after Machiavelli, really. And you have the famous speech, you know, now is the winter of our discontent, and in that he actually, you know, he's boasting of his skills. He says, "I'll set the murderous Machiavel to school." You know, basically saying, you know, I'll school Machiavelli. And so already he had this huge.
That's a hell of a claim.
Yeah, already had this huge reputation. Well, it was Richard III, but hey ho, I feel like we're getting a tad off topic. So, AM, would you like to drag us back with your shepherd's crook?
Well, there's one thing which I really want to elucidate, again, pertaining back to your point about the monarchia, Columba, which is the idea of the temporal domain of the nobility, in this case, the Guelph and the Ghibelline conflict, which we're seeing, you know, enter into a new phase, is really a conflict between the noble classes and the merchant classes, because as we're going to discuss in our next topic, which brings us towards, you know, the end of this period, the wars in Lombardy, what you see in De Monarchia, again, is this idea that, well, again, just bring this back to the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, that the Guelphs had often been associated with the merchant class, the Ghibellines have been associated with noble classes, is that this idea of a fundamentally new concept of government in Italy, which, like with Cola de Rienzi, it draws on it the ancient precedent set by Rome. This had already been established piecemeal, say, for example, in Venice, even though it's very important to establish that even though we have this republican conception of Venice, Venice began as a dominion of the Byzantine Empire. It didn't begin free, it didn't begin as a republic, even though there is a lot of historical revisionism to imbue itself with that idea. Part of the
there were a
Guelph
lot of
struggle.
lies. I believe the narrative was that it was a camp originally founded by Julius Caesar and stuff like this, you know.
But part of the Guelph conflict is that it manifests, especially in the heart of Guelphism in Italy, in Florence, into this new bastion of republican ideas. And of course, in contrast to that, you have this restoration, temporary restoration of the Ghibelline idea after the demise of the emperors in the form of the House of Visconti. And I think this is really important to note, because this is probably the only time during this period where there could have been a domestic Italian monarchy rivaling that of the old Lombard kings. And of course, this is frustrated, and it's a unification of these originally pro-Guelph and then, of course, Venice, these republican bastions, which rebel against this attempt to impose a monarchy, again, imbued with this Ghibeline symbolism. So talking about the House of Visconti, the Visconti have like an ancient heritage going all the way back to being parts of the imperial court of the Salian dynasty. Of course, the Salian dynasty arriving just after the demise of the Etonian dynasty in the beginning of the 11th century. And during what again is significant to note is that Milan had been the heart of the Lombard League, which had revolted against imperial authority first under Frederick II Barbarossa, and then again with Frederick II. But in 1277, you have Ottone Visconti, the then Archbishop of Milan, a loyal Ghibeline, who is invested with the title by Rudolf von Habsburg, now the King of the Romans, as Lord of Milan and Imperial Vicar in Italy. So in the heart of the center of the Lombard League, the struggle against imperial authority, now you're imbuing a position of power and almost as the imperial representative in Italy, not almost, as the imperial representative in Italy, in the heartland, which had formerly been, the center of the rebellions against the Italian states in terms of a dramatic turnaround. And of course, the issue with the Visconti, which ultimately dooms them, is that they never establish a fundamental principle of primogeniture. And of course, this is something you see routinely in Italy, is that invariably illegitimate sons, in addition to brothers, would try and stake out some sort of claim to a dominion. And of course, this happens repeatedly in the case of the Visconti. Henry VII, in addition to many other things, he arrives in Italy, and in 1310, one of the issues he resolves is the issue of the Visconti in Milan, and he sides with Matteo Visconti, who's later deposed, and then you have another succession war in which ultimately his son Lucino and later Giovanni begin massively expanding the Visconti domains. Just emphasize again on this map, all the green, how you could say how much of a stranglehold at one point, especially under Gian Galeazzo, the Visconti had over northern Italy, as opposed to these merchant republics. Even areas such as Genoa would basically become vassals or subjugated to the House of Visconti in Milan, again emphasizing the restoration of this, not necessarily this imperial ideal, but this royal and noble ideal as invigorated by this neo-Guelph, because this is really going beyond the Guelphs and the Ghibellines into this fundamental conception of the Italian state as being pro-monarchy or being pro-republic. So when we have the arrival of Gian Galeazzo, he starts off as the sole ruler of the Visconti territories in 1385, and by 1395 he is elevated. Basically, he buys the title. Again, significance of the prestige and power of the North Italian states, that he essentially buys the title of Duke, elevating Visconti essentially to the equivalent of royal house, and using that influence, even goes so far as to marry into the French royal house of Valois, even though he would periodically have schisms with the French, especially over the suzerainty of the city of Genoa. The fact that the Visconti have now risen to the point where not only they're imperial appointed, but they're now marrying into the royal families of Europe. And again, this French link to the Visconti is going to be crucial for understanding the Italian wars later. So just hold on to that idea. But from 1395 until 1402, Giovanni, again, probably more consciously than any other figure during this period, hopes to unite the former Lombard kingdom, of course, going back to our stream when we have the conquest of much of the interior of Italy by Alboin. And of course, he consciously styles his capital in, his court not in Milan, but in Pavia, which had been the center of Lombard power in Italy several hundred years before. And again, two essential points in this. One is that he needs to control the Romagna. And again, note how Venice barely has any sort of holdings in the terraferma, i.e. the mainland at this point. It's still connected mainly to the Stato di Mar, the state of the sea. And of course, as you can see, right in the middle of all of these Visconti territories is, of course, the Republic of Venice. And again, as we mentioned, the cultural center of Italy, thanks to Dante. In 1402...
Did you mean Florence there, buddy?
Sorry, what did I say?
Venice.
Oh, yes, sorry, absolutely.
Sorry, that's for my sake. I was just a little...
and the audience. No, I do correct me when I say stupid things like that. So in 1402, Galeazzo leads a siege to Florence, and simultaneously defeats the Bolognese at the Battle of Casalecchio. And again, one of the what-ifs of history is that Gian Galeazzo Visconti dies of a fever just 1 month after this. And so this idea of him actually uniting the Lombard kingdom under the House of Visconti effectively dies with him, because you have a further decade where, as with usual with the House of Visconti, there is infighting until finally you have an unambiguous duke ascended in the form of Filippo Maria. And again, just emphasizing how much of a threat the Milanese were basically considered, like Napoleon. Many of the Italian states in the Romagna, in Florence, and in Venice begin a series of constant wars for 30 years, from 1423 until 1454, essentially. And this leads to a major revision of even the conception of power in Italy towards the end of the Treaty of Lodi. So under the reign of the Doge here is Francesco Foscari, there is a major consolidation of the interior of the Venetian Republic. Essentially, Venice's vast territories in the terraferma are established during the dogeship of Francesco Foscari, and remain so virtually, the same territories. So we're talking about Friuli, we're talking about Padua, we're talking about Treviso, we're talking about Brescia, etc. All these territories were part of the Venetian ken from here on, as a result of these coalition conquests against the rising House of Visconti. And I think this is probably a good time to elaborate on the nature of Italian warfare during this point. I mean, we've sprinkled...
Can I just ask you a question? So the Visconti family, what was their view on the papacy? Where did they stand in that conflict?
Well, like I said, the papacy, I think it's important to note at this point, were at its lowest ebb.
Yes, so I can imagine. It's interesting. So would you characterize it as because you see this earlier on, when you have the Guelphs, and they retake Florence, and ostensibly they're for the Pope, right? But then they turn around and basically demand quasi-independence for Florence, nominal support for the Pope. So would you say that there's this idea of well, if we support the Pope, as opposed to the emperor, it might be easier for us to assert our own control?
Well, I think this is why the period Guelphs and Ghibellines really ends around the year 1400, and I think this is important to demonstrate how the nature of these conflicts has essentially changed beyond all recognition of the initial motivations for it. So as I mentioned, Guelphs and conflicts begins as a dynastic conflict, begins as a wider conflict regarding who is the supreme authority in Christendom, and then devolves into this intercity factional
cynical
conflict.
Yeah.
And basically towards the end, the Guelph faction again is associated with republicanism, and the Ghibeline faction is this lingering holdout from the imperial idea, which is associated with the Italian nobility in particular. And this, of course, even exists during the period of where Cosimo de Medici is the grey eminence of the Venetian Republic. Just going back to the papacy,
the ideas are sort of transposed into this totally new idea where it's imperial. It's an imperial idea, but for Lombardy, say.
Yes, or rather a royal idea. It's almost been diminished. It's no longer imperial. It's no longer claiming this universal authority. It's rather resurrecting this much older idea of a kingdom of Lombardy in Italy. So, for example, if you see on this map, we still have the Avignon papacy. This is 10 years before, more than 10 years before the Council of Constance. The Pope, due to the rise of all these local despots in the papal states, only barely controls the city of Rome, if that. If anything, the Pope is just a symbol of stability during the city of Rome, whilst you have all these, again, rival conflicts in Rome in particular, between the Orsini and the Colonna families. Whereas look over here, Venice takes advantage of the virtual collapse of papal authority in the Eastern Adriatic, and eventually during this period take over the city of Ravenna. And of course, the link between Ravenna and the papacy being the heart of the donations of Pepin. And again, we're going to see the rise of the Sforza dynasty in here at the same time, and the fact that the Visconti possessions are actually part of the donation of Pepin proper. So there has been this massive decline in the temporal authority of the Pope, so much so that I fundamentally believe that broader considerations about the temporal power, the spiritual power of the papacy and the imperial idea are no longer a consideration. This is simply about the monarchical idea rearing its head against the republican idea in Italy. Now that these concepts have been so diminished as a result of this, I mean, we're talking now nearly 300 years of continuous conflict, that it's fundamentally morphed into something else. And I think this is a good time to talk about the nature of warfare during this period. So we again mention the word condottieri consistently. Of course, the fundamental meaning of that term essentially being like a form of mercenary. I think it's important to gauge because, of course, one of the fundamental families that arrived during the Lombard Wars is the House of Sforza. Francesco Sforza is one of the principal condottieri, and of course, he originally sides with the Visconti. Eventually switches to supporting the Venetians, then mediates the conflict between them. And having married the daughter of Filippo Maria, in this case Bianca Visconti,
he didn't have a son, right?
He then becomes this is where the House of Visconti becomes the House of Sforza. Then he establishes himself with Florentine help as the Duke of Milan after all this. So Marcus, is there anything you want to elaborate as it pertains to the history of warfare during the early 15th century in Italy?
Well, like I have said to you previously, this ironically is not my my forte in terms of military history. But what can be said here is that the wars in Lombardy and the wars of the condottieri are quite emblematic of a fundamental change in how war is fought. You might say this is kind of, in some ways, the last of truly medieval warfare and the nascent beginnings of the period of warfare which follows. To start at the start of the wars, you still have that sort of heavy medieval armor. They still fight with swords and spears, heavy lances, that sort of thing. Cavalry still has barding on it, etc. And then by the end of the wars, you're talking and middle of the 1400s, you have the arrival of primitive hand cannons, arquebusiers, that sort of thing. This transition towards this early gunpowder weaponry, and in response to the early hand cannons too, you have this sort of you have a generation of this last kind of flourishing of heavy armor, what they call Gothic style armor, heavy plate, which is successful in preventing early firearms from penetrating armor. But as firearm technology rapidly improves throughout the 1500s, and the velocity and the mass of the projectiles increases, eventually nothing except the cavalry become sort of armored. When we start talking about the Spanish tercio, and Colombo in our previous stream mentioned the pike and shot kind of style of warfare.
Yeah, I mean, lines become almost impossible to break for the cavalry because they got shot to bits before they even get to the line, and once they get there, the pike formations are very hard to break through. And so you see, I mean, slightly later, once you get to the French coming in, Francois, you have the Battle of Marigliano, right? And the French lines are assaulted, but they don't use the cavalry, right? What they use instead, the Swiss and the Italians, is they use columns, which are quite unusual, because before you would march in a broad line, whereas now what they're doing is when they want to punch through the lines. So you have a sort of a column, maybe 5 abreast, 10 abreast of men with shots and pikes, and their idea is to just punch straight through the lines and then come round behind. And so it's a very different style. I would say although the kind of fighting that came before in the age of chivalry wasn't exactly, I mean, we have very rosy ideas about it, to say the least. I would say that this was more brutal, on average, anyway. I mean, if you look at the casualties, they do seem to increase, relatively speaking. And also, I mean, the firearms at this time are absolutely brutal. They tear, they tear and spin, and it's an ugly sight.
They're cumbersome and unreliable, and as liable to kill the user as the person
Yes,
at the wrong end
it'll
of the
just go
gun.
off in your face or something.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, well, a number of injuries were attested to this period of these early hand cannons basically rupturing in a person's face, and a person getting sort of facial and neck injuries as a result of these weapons blowing up in their faces. It's not until the end of the 1400s, you might say the beginning of the Conquistador period, where the reliability of these weapons starts to improve.
Yes, and in terms of the condottieri
But
more
it
generally,
happens quickly, by the way.
it
Sorry,
does. It
continue,
does.
remember.
No, that's an interesting point. Though it does happen remarkably quickly. Necessity is the mother of invention, I suppose, right? But yes, in terms of the condottieri and these constantly shifting alliances, that is something that you do notice a lot. I mean,
Yes.
you have
They
Sforza.
literally embody the terminology of mercenary.
Yes, they do. It's whoever will pay the highest, and so then you have Sforza. Sometimes he allies himself with oh god, I can't remember his name now. You have the Dukes of Urbino, and they make an alliance there, and then he allies himself with Malatesta, right? Malatesta, I've
Mr.
written about
Badhead.
Mr. Madhead, as we discussed before the show. That's the etymology of that name, Mad Mind or Bad Head.
Bad head, yeah.
And these kinds of men. I mean, it goes to show again, as you said, the total ineffectuality of the papacy at the time. I mean, there is a story that apparently Malatesta, upon being, he had conducted some military campaign that the popes didn't want, and so the pope sent a legate. an embassy to go and see this condottieri, Malatesta, who was from Rimini. He got called the Wolf of Rimini, and apparently Malatesta took the legate, who was a young man, outside in front of his army, and publicly sodomized him to the applause of his army, which gives you an idea of the sort of the climate of the time, shall we say?
Yes, quite. What's actually interesting, just if we want an origin point for the condottieri, is that the first attested condottieri which were founded were formed by Lodrizio Visconti, because we're talking about the Visconti family here, right? He was destroyed by a rival group of condottieri founded by his uncle Lucchino. And then, to add insult to injury, he called himself he called himself also the Company of St. George.
They have a total lack of respect, these men, because they've grown up in this sort of anarchy, whereas AM's put forward so clearly, all of these established ideas are just totally falling apart. I mean, there's a story where I think it might be Sforza or it might be Malatesta. When they're excommunicated, a bull of excommunication is brought to them. And what they do is they take the bull of excommunication, which is obviously on a big piece of parchment, and they force the priests who have brought the parchment to eat it all in front of them, and then they just kick them out. It's just this sort of they're just bullies, like bullies and mercenaries, and they have the run of the country for a century. It's madness.
It's quite indicative to this. I know I'm sort of diverging here, but it's just an interesting reflection on the mindset of Italy, because we've spoken obviously previously at length of the history of Rome and the Roman culture, and there might have been perhaps a bit of this in the among the civitas of ancient Rome, the what we call the plebs, or the proletarii in ancient Rome, right? This kind of bucking of authority and this sort of anarchy amongst the lower classes. And I have a feeling that this is sort of something that enters the Italian mindset very resoundingly during the condottieri period. And for those who don't know, this is just an example. It's a bit unrelated, but it's funny that when seatbelts were made mandatory in Italy in the 90s, rather than actually complying with the law, someone made an absolute monster of money printing T-shirts with a seatbelt across it. So the people just bought the T-shirts and got away without paying fines. And and it just reminds me of that thing about the papal bull. Like, rather than complying with the law, it's like, no, we're just going to defy it because we hate the laws.
No, but it's even you couldn't just say no or get out or leave. You have to
it's like
to
a
do this
ritual
cruel,
humiliation.
yes, theatrical response.
Exactly. Another quick anecdote I do want to make as well, for anyone who's actually a sports fan here. I am myself, and I do like my motor racing, for instance, and for those who are interested in the history of that, Enzo Ferrari, who actually founded the Ferrari Motor Company, is a very, very interesting man. And whenever he signed drivers who weren't good at racing in the wet, he used to always bring them into his office and say, "I am not the Duke of Modena." And absolutely nobody who was non-Italian understood the reference. And one driver came up to him and said, "Oh, Mr. Ferrari, what does this mean? Why do you call yourself the Duke of Modena?" He said, "The Duke of Modena was famous for having a band of condottieri who refused to fight in the rain." So it was a reference to the fact that the drivers were bad, like wet weather drivers, and the fact that these condottieri were so pampered and well, as you've attested to, they were well paid, that the Duke of Modena's condottieri refused to fight in the rain. And it's funny that a tycoon of the 20th century makes that reference 500 years later. Like, this is how
well, it plays an indelible. Yeah, it plays a role in the Italian sort of national mythology, I suppose. The sort of history of the Italian people. Yeah,
I mean, you got to think Enzo Ferrari is a man who actually was a pilot in the First World War, by the way.
I see. That's interesting as well, isn't it? Because there's that sort of romantic notions there. But I mean, one thing I will say is these things are highly variable, right? Not all of these men are sort of cruel brutes. I mean, you'll have someone like Malatesta, and I'm just scratching the surface of what that man got up to.
I love the name, and I'm glad I was able to tell you the etymology of it, because like literally in Italian, you could not just be more plain in giving someone.
It's very appropriate, isn't it? But then on the other side, at the exact same time, sometimes fighting against him, sometimes being sort of erstwhile allied with him, you have Federico di Montefeltro, who fights his way to the dukedom of Urbino, and of course Urbino becomes one of the hearts of Renaissance culture. There's blooming humanism there. The palace is absolutely beautiful. You have Balthasar Mariglione. Is it Mariglione? Balthasar, someone, it's escaped me, and he writes the Courtier, this book about how to be a pleasant courtier, and he writes it in the court of Urbino, because the conversations are so charming, everybody's so delicate, and indeed, actually, Raphael's father worked in the palace, doing some designs, and he brought along his son with him, and we have records of the young Raphael being there and taking in this culture of gentility, and so it played a big role, and in fact the Duke, one of my favorite quotes, he was asked one day, and this also it epitomizes the sort of new humanism, right? He was asked what is required to be a good ruler and to be loved by the people, and he said essere humano, to be human, and so to be human, and so you can see on the one hand you have Malatesta, on the other hand you have Montefeltro, and so the picture is not clear cut. Not all of these men are as savage as the Wolf of Rimini.
Exactly right. And just one thing, I'm sure AM wants to pick up and get to the end of this stream. But if you look at this map here, and this doesn't quite tell the story, because it's more just like of a broad allegiance to Visconti. But that you could just Google a map and just see the breakup of Italy politically. Is that unlike a somewhat more centralized power such as the Kingdom of France or the Kingdom of England, and this is also true to some degree of Serbia and Bulgaria prior to conquest by the Ottomans and other sort of powers in Europe at this time. Italy is hugely fragmented, and this is why if you travel to Italy today, almost all of these major cities which were existent in this time period, which is a lot of them, I'll just probably say the majority of them, most of them have city walls. And I've mentioned this in previous podcasts, I think, as well, but they have city walls. They have their own piazzas. They have their own sort of foundation church at the center of their cities. They have all the infrastructure and the construction, which is, how shall I say,
Yes, they have all of,
it is
they have a complete set of civic architecture. Each city, it's a sort of self-contained.
civic architecture and the infrastructure and the institutions to go with being a self-governing city-state. And it's, I mean, I'll rattle off a few of them. I mean, you'll see it in Padua, you'll see it in Cremona, you'll see it in Alessandria, you'll see it in Lucca, you'll see it in Parma and Bologna, and famously Forli, which is one of the smaller cities, but was invariably involved in these Lombard Wars and in the Condottieri period, and you can travel through any of these cities that are sort of north of Rome, north of in the northern half of Italy, and they are everywhere, and they were forced to do this because of their proximity, of their wealth, the fighting between them, despite the shall I say the fettering kind of fleeting loyalty of various bands of condottieri. The fighting between these cities was contentious, and you made a really good comparison, Columba. Much like ancient Greece, highly contested, highly proximal struggle amongst city-states, more or less.
Yes, and indeed, that sort of cruelty, perhaps, and that intense critical and competitive climate probably did a lot to advance the arts as well.
The arts and the sciences.
Say. I mean, that's what people like Vasari say, right? They say it's the air of criticism and fierceness that did this. I mean, many of these people were very cruel. I mean, the Florentines were, they loved jokes and bullying and dueling in the streets and what have you. And this attitude extended to the arts. But anyway, we should probably get onto the Treaty of Lodi. Is that not right, A.M.?
Yes, it is right. Thank you both for your contributions. I think it's important to note that since Alaric invaded Italy in the 5th century, there has been constant warfare on the Italian peninsula, incessant constant warfare. Even when you have a moment such as Belisarius and later Narses' reconquest of Italy, it's instantly undone either by in the case of Belisarius, by a revival of the Ostrogothic kingdom, and then under Narses by a Langobarд invasion led by Alboin. You consistently have wars in Italy. There is no prevailing peace and order, and again, just expressed by the horrificness of the fighting, which you just elucidated. However, after the fall of the Visconti family dies out in 1447. There's briefly a moment where Milan returns back to its earlier republican system of government under what is known as the Ambrosian Republic, of course, St. Ambrose being the patron saint of the city of Milan. And this is quickly defeated by a coalition, and again, more or less a organization by the Sforza family and the Medici family to install Sforza as Duke of Milan, however, over a much more diminished Milan compared to all of these city allegiances as elucidated here, and the vast Visconti inheritance. So the result being that you now have an alliance between Milan and Florence, so basically a diplomatic revolution isolating Venice from making any further territorial gains at the expense of Milan. And the effect of this is...
Sorry, Apostolic, if I may just say one thing. We have to be cognizant, too, that a Milanese war of succession occurs within the context of the Lombardy War as well.
What do you mean?
Well, in the sense that with the Treaty of Lodi and the following the death of Filippo Maria Visconti, there's a struggle to basically, because he died without a male heir. Let's not forget.
Yes, sorry.
And that's why Sforza was basically a leading candidate, even though the kingdom was, you might say, or the kingdom, that Milan was diminished and somewhat cut down to size. There was actually a struggle to determine who would become its leader. That's more what I meant. Sorry.
Sorry. Yes, of course, and this relates back to the Ambrosian conflict and the attempt to reinstall the Republic. But this issue about the Visconti succession war, and again, while Sforza is chosen because, of course, he is the son-in-law of the last Visconti Duke, this idea that the Sforzas are constantly having to deal with legitimacy is one of the reasons why Louis XII, in the middle of the Italian wars, will claim through his own descent through the Visconti, through his mother, that he has a personal claim which is better than Sforza's to place himself on the throne of Milan in the way that Charles VIII had put himself on the throne of Naples due to his Angevin ancestors. So again, this idea of this being, again, as part of a broader succession war is important to note, especially in the Italian wars later on. But in this particular instance, it is this diplomatic revolution between the Duchy of Milan switching towards its Florentine allies, and Florence and Milan collectively, again, checking both each other's expansion into the, again, more decentralized areas of the Romagna. Of course, the Romagna, which had been part of the papal enclave, but again, the principal power now is not even the Pope, it's the House of Este at Ferrara. Of course, you have the burgeoning power of the Venetians, who probably more than any other power have expanded significantly in this war over Italian hegemony, annexing vast areas to this terra firma. But also you have the burgeoning power of Aragon during this period. In 1442, the Angevin dynasty in Naples, which had been there since Charles of Anjou some nearly 200 years before, had been deposed by the House of Aragon under King Alfonso, and briefly reuniting the kingdoms of Naples and Sicily together. And in addition to the fact that the Aragonese also controlled Sardinia, there was a prospect of opening up a new future war, possibly led by the Aragonese or these other coalitions. However, what is affected at the Treaty of, and again, it's important to note that Alfonso dies in 1458, and one of his illegitimate sons, Fernando, takes over control over the Naples, which again is going to lead into the issues regarding the Italian wars. But what's important is that from 1454 until 1494, we have something which is basically unprecedented in Italian history, which is 40 years of peace organized by the Italian principalities themselves and officiated under by Nicholas V. So this is an agreement among the principal states of Italy, namely Lombardy, Venice, Milan, Florence, and Naples, under the supervision of Nicholas V, to respect a concept of balance of power and to not to go to war with each other. And again, this is led by major charismatic personalities in the form of Alfonso, in the form of Cosimo de Medici, and then Lorenzo il Magnifico, and of course the now powerful House of Sforza, where all of these wars, whether they be the Ghibelline and Guelph conflicts, or even the investiture controversy before then, and even the Sicilium Obscurum before then, all of these conflicts have temporarily died down, and we're accepting this notion of balance of power. And again, Italian interests determining the affairs of the continent without having to rely on foreign rulers, because of course the Aragonese connection is broken, and the patrimony of Aragon is divided, with Ferdinando de Aragon taking over Naples in 1458. So in terms of, again, a precedent in Italian history, this is incredibly significant. And I think, of course, it tragically gets broken down, and we'll discuss the reasons for that.
But we would be safe in saying that this 50 odd years of peace that is initiated by the Treaty of Lodi and Sforza, in my opinion, what I see there is because obviously there's still these intense rivalries, right, and this sense of competition, and it's almost as if soft power becomes more important, you know, and these strong rivalries between the cities of the north are transformed into rivalries of architecture and art. You know, that's the new way of competing. You know, and you'll have all of these new schools. You know, you'll have the Viennese school and what have you. You know, the Florentine
Venetian
school. Yes, the Venetian school. Sorry, what did I say?
Viennese school.
Viennese, very different, very different. But yes, you have this
Italian Vienna.
Sorry?
The Italian Vienna.
The Italian Vienna, yes.
Well, you have heard the quip that Munich is Italy's most northern city, right?
I have, actually. I have a friend who always goes on about how Munich is very cultured. I'll have to take his word for it. But yes, and of course at the same time we do have the Medicis rising.
Yes.
And this
oh my God, how beautiful is that photo? That's amazing.
This is whenever possible, I try and find older photos rather than more modern photos. For some reason, I have a contempt for modern photos, but there you are.
They're too
Rightly
clear.
so.
They're too clear and crisp and dull. You know, there's something so evocative about the older photos.
And also,
So
there's
this-
no one in here who's acting inappropriately. It's all very calm and civil.
Indeed.
So this is a good time to talk about. I mean, we've already discussed the rise of the Medici Bank and Giovanni de Medici in particular. However, as we elucidated, it didn't seem clear that with Giovanni, who basically had no interest in politics other than retaining his own possessions and ensuring that his two sons, in this case Cosimo being the principal son, maintained this aspect of civic virtue and therefore didn't try to undermine the credibility and basically create notoriety for the family. He never tried to exert any formal direct influence over the city. And again, as we discussed, the main interest, the business of the family was actually in Rome and the service of the Pope as opposed to the city of Florence itself. I mean, even most of the possessions of the family were in Mugello, which is outside of Florence, and the countryside surrounding it, rather than the city itself. So from 1420, when Cosimo takes over the running of the Medici Bank, it didn't seem obvious that they would actually be establishing a direct, not a political system led by essentially the Medici during this period. And we've already discussed how Giovanni cultivated this idea of this dignified public image and only influencing things indirectly through finance. Well, Cosimo takes this a step further and effectively becomes the grey eminence of the affairs of Florence. Again, seldom occupying direct political office, but using his own influence in the signorii of Florence. Again,
Yes, it's basically his choice who gets elected prior, right? And,
Yes.
and for those who don't know, the Florentines, in typically chaotic fashion, they elect a prior during Republican Florence whose term is 2 months, and then another one is elected, which is
well, again, this is
very interesting.
This is the revival of Roman Republican values, and if anything, these Republican values, this again imitation back on the Roman Republic, is revived by the fact that they have been in contest for nearly 50 years at this point with the monarchical power of the Italian Visconti, and of course Cosimo de Medici arrives right in the middle of the wars in Lombardy, and his first affair actually goes very poorly. He from 1429 his father has died, and until 1433 he takes an active interest in the affairs of the war. And there is this failed gambit to conquer the pro-Visconti Republic of Lucca. And this fails, and his main competition, the Albizzi family, uses this as a pretext to imprison him. Many want him executed, basically believing the Medici influence needs to be curbed. However, instead, he uses this as a form of exile. First, he goes to Padua, and then to Venice, just to illustrate the power of the Medici family and how instrumental they were to the rise of Florence itself. This isn't just the rise of Medici, this is also the rise of the city of Florence. The exile of Cosimo de Medici to Venice actually causes a mass capital flight away from Florence to Venice as part of this grand elaborate circle around again the Venetian bank in Florence. So out of necessity, in 1434 the exile is lifted and Cosimo returns and embarks upon this incredible period of 30 years of indirect rule, where he's intent on, again, rooting out factionism, which had resulted in his original deposition, but again, controlling things indirectly through the signori, and again, cultivating this idea, as you can see this image on the left, that he is basically he's evoking the idea of the model citizen, even though he's building the Medici Palazzo, even though he's cultivating this grand idea of the Medici as the not only patrons of the arts but the foremost patrons of the arts in Europe at this point. He is again occupies no formal role, and he's not establishing a lordship in the same way that the Visconti were over the city of Milan. So throughout his time, and again this is important to note, the idea of a duchy of Tuscany where the Medici exercise hereditary sovereignty only comes into pass after the fall, or what you can say the early Medici, and after you have the deposition of the Medici by Savonarola, and you have the temporary Republican phase, of course, of which Machiavelli is a fundamental aspect of that. And then finally, in the beginning of the 16th century, you have the return, and the Medici abandon this Republican ethos in Florence, and Florence becomes the capital of the Duchy of Tuscany. And of course,
I would say
its main rival, the city of Siena.
Yes, and I would say in terms of this Republican image that they try and portray, you can even see it somewhat in this portrait of Cosimo, right? Where I mean, if you go back and look at Roman art, right? I mean, you in the Roman Republic, there's a real shift between the Republic and the Empire. Where in the Empire, you get these very idealized portraits of the emperors and the nobles, sort of based on Greek models of Alexander the Great. And such like, but in the Republican period, if you look at the portraiture, receding hairlines are in evidence. There's heavy wrinkling, and there's this idea that you want to look weathered and stressed and responsible, because that's the sort of the ideal of the grave Republican man. There's this seriousness, and you can see this in the sort of image that Cosimo tries to portray, and also in much of the busts and portraiture more widely at the time. There is this this sense of virtuous republicanism. But I mean that's another thing that I would like to bring up. I mean, you mentioned that they weren't the sole patrons of the arts. I mentioned that you have this rivalry between cities and between rival schools, but in terms of patronizing of art and architecture, there's also intense competition within each city. Within Florence, I mean, at the same time as Cosimo is patronizing the baptistry and the cathedral, you also have families like the what are they called? Is it the Papacy family? I think it's the Papacy family, and they built a chapel as well, which was at the exact same time you have the Papacy chapel, and so there's all this sort of intra-familial competition as well.
Sort of a proxy war via what's the word I used before? Like when they sponsor artists, what's that term called?
Patronizing.
Basically
patronage.
Proxy through patronage.
Yeah, of course.
In terms of, you mentioned this competition through soft power. Well, of course, one of the great boons for the Venetian Republic, which again inspires a coterie of art, is there had been again a ecumenical council meant to be held at the city of Ferrara for the supposed unification of the Eastern Church with the Western Church. And of course, due to Cosimo's influence in 1439, he affects the change of the location of this council from Ferrara to Florence, and it's in Florence that we have the introduction of Gemistus Plethon, and this obsession, you can say, with Cosimo de Medici to actually revive Neoplatonism within the confines of Florence itself. So you have Gemistus Plethon actually remains way beyond the confines of the council and becomes a lecturer. A public library is established again, dedicated to the work of Plato. One of the first ever completed Latin translations by Ficino is created during this time.
Yeah, you have the Library of San Marco. I think it's San Marco.
Is that right? I can't quite remember. I have to take your word for it. And then, of course, you have the establishment of the Florentine Neoplatonic Academy, which would last until the death of Lorenzo I Magnifico, who was, of course, the grandson of Cosimo de Medici. So, and again, patronizing the emperor of Byzantium himself, John VIII, again, Palaiologos. And, of course, this would lead to a temporary union of the Church and Rome, of course, would actually cause a major stir back in Constantinople, and of course the any such union would be undone, of course, by Mehmed II's speedy conquest of the Byzantine Empire and the subjugation of Gennadius to the Ottoman Sultan. So I think, again, in addition
to his credit, was actually against that, by the way, before the conquest.
Absolutely. Yes. This wasn't that he wasn't undermining prior to the conquest.
And in terms of this,
he wasn't a Lucas Notaris,
You're name dropping all these guys. I'm struggling, but
you'll find out in due course, Colombo.
Oh, I'm sure I will. But in terms of Neoplatonism, it's also at this time that you have one of the most famous philosophers of sort of early Renaissance Italy, which is Pico di Mirandola, who Thomas More actually wrote a biography about him, and he wrote this complex Neoplatonic treatise, which I'm not going to attempt to explain because I barely understand it myself. But he also was a very strong humanist, and it's at this time that these ideals, again, still subsumed within religion. All these guys are Catholics, but Mirandola wrote the Oration on the Dignity of Man, and it talks and it's just talking about all the wonderful faculties that man has been granted, and then there's this idea that again, I mentioned, wealth is liberal work. There's this idea that these things, if we're going to make money, a justification of it, a new justification is the expansion of human faculties. We can use this wealth for these worthy purposes.
In addition to, greatest example of that, in addition to patronizing the artistic works of Donatello, Cosimo de Medici, of course, funds the work of Brunelleschi's Duomo, as you can see on the east. Just to emphasize, the Duomo in the cathedral in Florence had been without a dome for decades up until this point, kind of like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, which was a 200-year creation, and again, even the leaning nature of it was actually built into the design due to the original floor. The cathedral was left domeless, and Brunelleschi, again, was a bankrupt architect and considered basically a nutter. However, he brings in this radical new conception of constructing the dome, which, again, it needs to be pointed out, the dome is, I think, the largest dome in the world, at least up until recently. And even more so than I believe Michelangelo's dome on St. Peter's Basilica. And this, in terms of this prestigious monument, not only is under the Medici patronage that this you can say eyesore on the city of Venice, the roofless top of the cathedral is finished, but that it could be illustrated as a principal monument, not only as a power of the Medici family itself, but almost overcoming nature itself.
Yes, it was huge, and of course, it's also inspired by, again, harking back to Rome and the Pantheon, and then you also mentioned Cosimo's patronage of Donatello, which is hugely important for the history of art, because Donatello was you mentioned Ghiberti, who did the baptistry doors, which, by the way, took him about 20 years, those doors. And you can see in the figures classical nude figures, but they're all on a very, very small scale. It's these little self-contained castings on the door. Donatello comes along, and with the patronage of Cosimo, creates the first freestanding male nude statue, or just nude statue in general. There hadn't been a female one since antiquity, which is the Bronze David. I think it was the 1430. It was completed around that time, and it was a masterful piece of casting as well. Incredibly pushing the bounds of technology, and Donatello worked incredibly hard on it. And it was just a massive leap forward from an art history perspective.
Also, it's worth noting too that Michelangelo did actually refer to Ghiberti's doors into the baptistry as being the doorways to heaven.
Yes, the gates of paradise.
His description of them, and like you say, it took him the best part. I think he more or less spent 15 years on each door.
Well, what happened is, once he finished the first set, which took him about 20 years, he got commissioned for another set.
Yeah,
which must have been
what an
that must have been a shocker. Yeah.
and what's amazing too is and I don't want to make this a critique of modernism or whatever, but is that there's a period of time here where men who have a mind which is captivated by imagination and by inspiration and passion, who are quite willing to spend decades of their lives crafting things which will stand the test of time, and every pair of eyes which sets upon them will be astonished. And I mean, I've been to Firenze, I've been to the Duomo myself, and I saw them when I was 12 years old, and I was impressed by them, and I didn't really know what they were. And the next time I saw them when I was 24, I literally didn't have words, and I'm not a person without a vocabulary, and
And they just
still to
and
this
these
day
men,
can't describe them. I still can't describe them. They're just
No,
Michelangelo's words are perfect.
I've
and
actually
also,
sort
I
of,
mean, these men.
sorry, Club, it's actually incredible. You know, have you ever been to the top of the Duomo? It's actually
No, I
incredible.
didn't, because I have a terrible fear of heights. I'm a
It's actually
farmer. I don't
incredible.
like heights.
Going through the interior and seeing the outer dome and the inner dome, and actually going through, because again, it's a tiny little space in the middle, just between the dome of the interior and the outer. Again, just the amazing climb to get to the top, and just again appreciating just the sheer scale, and again the monumental achievement it is again in the 15th century.
Yes, and also, I mean, these men ruined their health doing these things as well. That's another thing we should point out.
It crippled them totally.
Yes, it crippled them, but I mean, it's just it's the level of dedication, and it's all towards unified schemes, unified plans. I mean, it's inconceivable. I mean, we've had 100 years of an art world where art is made to sell and sell quickly, and the purpose and the main goal of art is novelty, right? You will have some absurd gimmick, and that will be all there is to it. There's no depth. Whereas, I mean, some of these works, you could look at them for 20 years. I mean, you could walk around these places your entire life and scratch the surface.
There's this really astonishing intersection between, you might say, a divine inspiration, a technical marvel of the individual, and this relentless desire for beauty to be expressed via those two prisms, which is absolutely embodied by this period. And I think this period is probably our European civilization's greatest exemplar of that. And
that's also
I think we're cheaper for not having that in our lives, I think, personally.
We are. And just to bring it back, I mean, this all goes back to the philosophy of people like Dante, who are living in the Gothic world. I mean, in the same way that, through Beatrice, she can be, through the love of your, this beautiful girl, Beatrice, you can contemplate the love of God. It's that same idea transposed, that through the beauty and wonder of these things, people can be raised up. Even the average man can be raised up to think about these things and feel these things. Which, I mean, some people today in their cynicism might call it naive, but I mean, it's you can't help but be impressed.
I mean, a small anecdote being to think that the roof of the Sistine Chapel existed in Michelangelo's mind, and he put that,
yes,
he painted it, and it's arguably one of the greatest achievements of artistic history, full stop.
It's the confidence that's required as well. I mean, over a long period, you need this confidence that we just don't seem to have today. But anyway, I mean,
this isn't an art critique. We're sort of getting away from.
No, I think it's a wonderful way to end the period, because of course we'll be revisiting. Obviously, this is a two-part episode, really. So we'll be revisiting all of this again, talking about Michelangelo, talking about Leonardo da Vinci, talking about the Italian Wars and the fate of
you're spoiling me, Am. You're spoiling me.
We'll be discussing all this in detail, and of course returning to Machiavelli again on the stream, the Italian Wars. Yes, Marcus?
May I just end on one last thing? Just because we're talking about patronage, proxy by patronage, and we can't talk about Renaissance Italy without referencing San Gimignano, which in Italian is called La Città delle Belle Torri, which means the town of fine towers. And basically it was a competition between rival families within San Gimignano, and they would actually build these towers, and one being higher than the other was nothing more than an expression of vanity. These towers had no civic or military value, to the point where a papal bull was passed. I believe it was a papal bull, but it was definitely from the Pope, a regulation to limit the size of these towers. And if you actually travel to San Gimignano, which I have, they're littered with these otherwise useless towers, which several of them have been turned into like hotels and Airbnbs and stuff nowadays. But they were literal expressions of power and vanity within the town. And I love the fact that the Italians actually call it, they reference it themselves as Città delle Belle Torri. I think it's magnificent. Sorry, yeah, that's my last divergence.
We covered it briefly on the Guelphs and Ghibellines stream, but in terms of
I did too. How remiss of me.
Yes,
sorry.
Again, in terms of associated with this period, though, I mean, this period of the ever increasing towers is, of course, more related to this period.
I did forget the Fraser. That's why I wanted to mention it. But anyway.
So the first super chat from Kolkia for €5. Love your streams. Is there a reason why a lot of your maps are in Dutch? One map was in Dutch. I do apologize for this. Without sort of going around and actually making my own maps, which would obviously consume far too much of my time, I try and find maps in English, but in this case, for some reason, there isn't a glut of maps from around about 1100 until the Italian Wars, so 1494. For some reason, there are very few maps of Italy, so I had
It's
to
a
get
little,
the,
it's a little treat to expand your vocabulary. Königreich is kingdom. Come on, guys, it's not that hard.
Also, in AM's defense too, because I'm a massive fan of maps myself, is that a lot of English maps are actually hidden behind paywalls. So you get like the 1080 by 980 whatever preview shot on Google, but if you actually want the expanded map, it's behind a paywall, and then you can't get it, and it's a pain in the backside. Whereas a lot of these foreign maps, whether it's in Italian or German, specifically German, because they have a very strong map culture, it's easy to get access to.
Yes, and to be perfectly honest, as you probably guessed, Marcus, I'm a huge map and actually an amateur cartographer.
Well, we share that passion together.
the German maps, to my estimation, are far superior to the English maps. So
yes,
if that means you just need to countenance learning a bit of German, then again, the whole point of the stream is learning. So
suck it up.
So suck it up. Marcus 588 for $6 Columba and Furious EU4 OPM lol stream when? Oh dear.
I think I would get so angry and bitter that would be perhaps a poor idea. I don't know. maybe in time we've got a lot to get through.
It could be brilliant. It could be a disaster, but I don't know. I'll be happy to do it for the memes, but that's about it.
Walking on a knife edge there for sure. Yes.
Columba and I will think about it. Let's just say that
we will think about it. We'll put it under consideration. Yes.
Oh, I can't remember, but one of the regular viewers for this channel made this base and insulting observation that this channel's primary function should be to serve as an EU4 law channel. So
lore, I hate that. There's nothing worse. Yeah.
Actually, someone else made an EU reference in here today. I actually lost the comment, but it was hilarious. It's like, it's for map painter aficionados. Anyway,
that's great. That's funny.
So no, that's never going to happen. And if Marcus and Columba want that to happen, it's not happening on my channel. So there you are.
We are verboten. There you go. We are verboten.
We are verboten.
John Boy for €10. I missed most of this due to pesky family stuff. I will listen tomorrow, but I already know it's going to be excellent. Thanks so much, AM, Columba and Furious. Well, thank you for your preemptive confidence, but I don't know. We could have messed it up. I don't know. Obviously, I would have messed it up. Obviously, Marcus and Columba would be wonderful, but hopefully it'll be hopefully it'll be wonderful by the time you can you can have it.
I'm no stranger to chaotic family situations myself, my friend, but luckily you can watch it all again.
And I'm Italian, so I completely understand. And in the spirit of this stream, grazie mille, mio amico.
Grazie mille, mi amore.
Judge Caligula Bushman for €2 says, "What happened to Marcus?" Yes, Furious Pertinax. What happened to Marcus?
But yes. Oh,
they're talking about the assassination attempt.
Yes, I'm left disfigured from my appearance on UI. Sorry, no, I just changed it from because we had 6 people on Unpopular Opinions. I had to short my name, so I will put Marcus back. Caligula Bushman, thank you for mentioning that, because I just realised now when I read the comment, I thought, what happened? I'm right here, but yes, the word. Thank you. I'll be Marcus Furious Pertinax next time.
Barbarian from Hero Quest for £5 says nothing. Do say something, Barbarian from Hero Quest.
Yes, that's your chance on the podium. Scream from the mountaintops.
We're all here. We're literally captive. We are compelled to answer your questions.
We are honor bound.
At us in the chat before we leave. We'll answer something.
Lady of Shalott for £5. The artists who created beauty in the scale were touched by the divine. That is the explanation. As Marcus says, one is lost for words on seeing it. And yes, I think that is a fundamentally correct observation that they are appealing to something which is much higher, which us moderns can barely conceive of.
Indeed, indeed. I think
Very true.
I think the Lord had a hand in that. Indeed.
Divine inspiration can go a long way to furnishing the mind with beauty, which sadly has become increasingly bereft. But that's a conversation for another day. Can I answer one comment I actually saw in the chat before that was at me, Apostolic?
Sure.
Just to say that yes, St. Francis of Assisi was, in fact, the patron saint of animals. If the chat didn't know, because Columba was talking about some of his philosophy regarding nature and natural law, and how humans should interact with nature. And I don't know if we want to maybe think about it, but for me, Assisi does probably make the best attempt between sort of integrating notions of human existence and the natural world through a prism of Christianity. One might call it sort of a Christian asceticism combined with a naturalist esotericism. He tries to combine these ideas, and I think he does a very good job of it, and I think he should be applauded for it, because I can't imagine it's an easy thing to do, from a standpoint of being a monk.
Especially, yeah, I was going to say, especially when you're going around spending most of your time, treating lepers and rebuilding old churches with your own hands. He was a remarkable man.
And of course, if the world half goes back to normal, I don't know if either of you guys have been, but I would definitely encourage anyone in the chat to go to Assisi. It's one of the most beautiful places in the world, never mind in Italy, and the history around St. Francis is remarkable.
Yes,
absolutely. One last minute super chat to Judge Caligula Bushman. Because Marcus is harder for AA to pronounce, that pertains OFC lol. I think that's inspired me to start a contest in the vein of the fact that AA can't pronounce apostolic. I think for the next, as penance for streaming at the same time as me, I think it was last week.
Yes.
For next week's, or rather for this Friday, actually no, UO is tomorrow, isn't it? So
yes.
no, for unpopular opinions tomorrow, why doesn't everyone just send AA super chats with hard to pronounce words? Just to see
well,
do
that. Yes, make him suffer.
Just everyone super chat apostolic,
Although I will say, AM, I'm going to call you out. This entire stream you've been pronouncing burgeoning wrong.
Oh dear, have I?
Yes, I'm afraid so, my friend. I'm just too polite to correct you until the end.
What have I been? Oh dear, I can't even remember how I pronounced it. What have I been saying?
In regards to AA apostolic, I think I've come off worse for it because I've ended up as being the Pasta Aussie as a result of being on this stream. So
Pasta Aussie, yes.
Which, I mean, put this way, I'm Italian, so it actually works. I will gladly put in brackets if I do appear on UO again. But yeah, like he literally just went, "Oh, you're just now the Pasta Aussie," so I have to live with it now.
I've heard worse.
Indeed. But anyway, we move on. It's all fun and games.
I don't know, abandoning all my previous sense of humility, I would call that an honorific, but there we are.
An honorific, nice. I like that.
Anyway, obviously the stream's come to an end. Just again, big mentions. Thanks to my patrons. You can, if you want to donate to the channel, you can subscribe through the link to Subscribestar. Do like, share, and comment on this video. Leave a nice comment or a point of constructive criticism. It really does help and helps push the channel. Regarding streams for the future, we have what do we have next time? Orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. We're going to be talking about the origins of Russia.
Yes, we're back to the east.
Back to the east. So yes, we starting off with Russia, will be ultimately coming back to the Ottomans. So do watch that. Marcus, you and I have a stream on Wilhelm II, Kaiser Wilhelm II, next Wednesday.
We do indeed.
That'll be good.
And
looking forward to it. My other passion.
Other than that, yeah, it's just up to the shilling. So Marcus first, anything you want to show?
Not much aside from you guys did mention unpopular opinions last week, which I was kindly invited on, and a good deal of the chat I think watched it because I heard Lady Charlotte talking about it. That I kind of went on a bit of a black pill regarding Australia being economically gutted. So if you remotely have an interest in that or just want some sort of shenanigans to listen to, because AA stream's always fun. These two guys will attest to that. It's worth watching. And aside from that, no, just you mentioned it, Apostle. Like, I've got 2 things lined up with you for next week, so everyone, buckle up and be ready for that. And again, everyone, thank you for the kindness and for the for patience and listening to us 3 guys, blabble on about history. And until
It
next
never
time.
ceases to amaze.
Indeed.
Columbo?
I actually finished my article. It should be appearing in the next edition of the Roig Nationalists Man's World magazine. So look forward to that. Again, it's about Clovis, who we've discussed on this channel, but also Cabeza de Vaca, who's a lesser known, though no less impressive figure.
Well, thank you very much for that, Columba, and thank you
Sounds
again,
interesting.
Marcus, for coming on.
Welcome.
Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and good night.